Chapter 336. Dean took the opportunity to pull away from the lizard and turned around to shoot again. Puff! Another arrow hit the lizard's mouth. The distance between the two was more than 10 meters. The speed of the arrow was extremely fast. After the two arrows hit, Dean estimated that even if it didn't die, it would be seriously injured. After the inspiration brought by the improved shark lance, in addition to filling his own arrows with mercury, he also left about a centimeter of paralysis venom inside. This effect was hundreds of times stronger than smearing venom on the arrowhead. Dean didn't pay any more attention to the chameleon. He left it to fend for itself. He turned around and continued to run forward. However, the ambush of the chameleon had calmed down a lot. He didn't dare to rush blindly. After all, this was a dangerous wilderness. He didn't want to fall into the belly of other monsters before he reached the cave of the splitter. That would be the end of the world. Whoosh! Dean shook off the injured chameleon and soon came to the place where he had encountered the magic claw crocodile quagmire. The quagmire was the same as last time, but the soil had become dry and hard. There was no movement of the magic claw crocodiles. Plus, the weather was cold, so the water in the swamp had dried up a lot. Dean stopped and sniffed the air around him. The function of smell was very low when running. It was the same as ordinary people. That's why the hounds would stop and sniff every time they tracked a place. Soon, through the surrounding smells, Dean roughly grasped some information. He carefully sneaked forward. An hour later, Dean finally came to the vicinity of the Splitter's cave. Originally, it would only take him 10 minutes to reach the place, but he had to stop along the way. He was always vigilant against the monsters hidden in the ruins and jungle. Sometimes he would encounter strange smells that blocked his way. So he had to take a detour. It took him several times longer to reach the place. Dean looked at the cave from afar. He was relieved when he saw the boulders outside the cave. He quietly groped and looked up and down. It was difficult to drill into the cave. He was lying on top of a pile of boulders, listening attentively and sniffing with his nose. Through the cracks between the boulders, he could smell a thick, rotten smell of blood. This bloody smell was mixed with many other strange smells. Obviously, it was the corpses of several monsters that Splitter had hunted. There was also a strong smell of the Splitter. Dean sniffed and soon smelled the scent of a small Splitter. Although this cave was a Splitter's cave, but there were subtle differences in the smells of the big and small Splitters. Just like the body odor of different people would be different. Did it hatch again? Dean was surprised and happy. Every young Splitter would be a legendary monster in the future. Its value was infinite. This will greatly reduce the hunter's sacrifice and improve the hunting efficiency. Dean thought as he dug the pit. He didn't have any tools in his hand, so the efficiency of making traps in the pit was slow. After half an hour, he dug a big pit. He used the ropes and arrows he had with him to make a simple trap in the pit. Although it was a common beast trap, but the word common often meant excellent. Only excellent and effective would be widely used. Dean came to the boulders in front of the cave after the trap was made. He moved the boulders down and arranged them in different directions. He placed them outside the cave and around the trap like chess pieces. The purpose of this was to limit the activities of large monsters like Splitter. Dean rested several times on the way. After an hour, Dean finally moved a small gap in the boulder pile. It was located at the top of the boulder pile, which was connected to the cave. With the appearance of the gap, the strong smell of rotten meat drifted out of the cave, making Dudien's stomach churn. His keen sense of smell made his face extremely ugly at this moment. Dean endured the pungent smell and climbed to the top of the boulder pile. He looked down and saw a figure in the dark cave. It looked like countless swords were tied together. At the same time, the sound of stones falling came from the bottom of the boulder pile. He looked down and saw a small Splitter climbing up the boulder pile. Dean's face slightly changed. He didn't know whether to be happy or bitter. The difficulty of hunting two Splitters had increased by several times. He quickly jumped down from the boulder pile and ran to the edge of the boulder pile more than 50 meters away. This was the best hunting angle he had prepared. The sound of stones echoed from time to time in the cave. After a moment, Splitter's body was revealed at the entrance of the cave. This Splitter was a bit smaller than the one Dean had used to enter the inner wall. The color of the carapace was black and the luster was deeper and more gorgeous. It seemed to be well developed and full of nutrition. Dean squinted his eyes and aimed the arrow. He wasn't in a hurry to shoot but waited for Splitter to climb out of the gap. Then he aimed at its eyeball. He was familiar with the structure of Splitter's body after a long time of observation. At the moment the arrow was aimed at its weakness. Whoosh! The arrow passed in the blink of an eye. The Splitter was lying on top of the boulder pile. It seemed to be looking around. It was curious about everything in the outside world. Even the warm sunshine made it feel very novel. Just as it was sizing up the place, a sharp whistling sound suddenly rang out. Puff! The arrow had hit the Splitter's body by the time it recovered. The arrow was too sudden and too fast. Moreover, it was the first time Splitter had come out of the cave, so it hadn't been able to adapt to the strong sunlight yet. Therefore, it was hit by the arrow without any suspense. Moreover, the arrow had hit its eyeball at the core of its body. Squeak! Splitter screamed in pain. Its body swayed from side to side. If it had been hit as soon as it crawled to the gap, it would have fallen into the cave due to the pain. But now, it was lying in the gap between the rock pile and the cave dome. It couldn't move forward or retreat, nor could it hide. It kept screaming in pain. Dean breathed a sigh of relief when he saw the arrow hit its target. He put the arrow on the string again and looked at its swaying body. His eyes narrowed tightly. The irregular swaying made it difficult for him to predict its movements. Blinding one of its eyeballs was not enough to completely eliminate its combat effectiveness. After all, it was a legendary monster. In terms of species level, it had evolved extremely far ahead. Even if it lost its eyeballs, it still had other ways to sense the surrounding danger, but it was not as convenient and fast as using its eyes. Whoosh! The second arrow was shot. This time it aimed at its screaming mouth. Whoosh! As he swung his sharp limbs in a chaotic manner, he accidentally knocked down the arrows that were flying towards him. Dean frowned, but he wasn't discouraged. He put the third arrow. It seemed that he was ready for this. He aimed at the mouth of Splitter again. Splitter's limbs touched the arrow. It seemed to sense the direction of the arrow. It screamed and waved its limbs to form a shield. It firmly protected the front of its body. At the same time it retreated. Bang! The arrow hit the sharp-edged shield and immediately broke. Dean's face sank. Although it was still a juvenile, but its hunting level was around 24 or 25. It wasn't easy to kill it. He took out an arrow and nocked it, quietly waiting for an opportunity. However, the opportunity never appeared again. The Splitter had a strong sense of self-protection. It used the shield to protect the vital parts of its body. It retreated all the way into the cave. Dean picked up the stones on the ground and threw them at the Splitter. The stones fell into the cave. After a moment, the sound of breaking echoed from the cave. Soon another Splitter climbed out of the cave. There was no injury on its body. It should be another one. Dean was happy to see the Splitter trying to climb out. He aimed at its eyeball and shot the arrow when it was halfway through the cave. Puff! The arrow immediately hit its target. The little Splitter had just excitedly climbed halfway when it was suddenly attacked. It immediately let out a painful scream. Dean continued to shoot the arrow. Whoosh! Whoosh! When the little Splitter received the attack, it didn't react immediately. Its sharp blades weren't concentrated, so its mouth was suddenly hit by an arrow. Its screams suddenly rose by hundreds of decibels, and then it quickly stopped. It waved its sharp limbs and retreated into the cave. When it was burning, he wiped out the flame, and suddenly there was a burst of smoke. He then covered the weeds with green vines to extinguish the flame, and suddenly it turned into a lot of smoke. He found some leaves that looked like banana leaves and used them as a fan, fanning the thick smoke out of the cave. The thick smoke surged into the cave and floated into it. Under the continuous attack of the smoke, after half an hour, the two little splitters finally couldn't bear it anymore and slowly crawled out. Their movements were slow and seemed to be weak. Dean smirked and continued to vigorously fan the smoke. At the same time, he used the surrounding stones to fill the entrance of the cave, making the entrance narrower. Hiss, the two little splitters couldn't make a sound. They made hoarse hissing sounds. It seemed like they were begging and indignant. Dean waited for them to come close, then immediately picked up a big stone and threw it. The two little splitters were slow. One of them couldn't dodge and was hit by the stone. It fell to the ground. The other little splitter was scared when it saw the fierce intruder. It didn't dare to get close to the cave. Dean wasn't in a hurry. He sat steadily at the entrance and continued to fan the smoke to consume their physical strength. The smoke wasn't just to choke people. After all, there was a big difference between monsters and humans and beasts. Especially monsters that had evolved to a very high level could even be immune to the smoke. However, the real purpose of Dean's smoke wasn't to choke them but to reduce the oxygen in the cave. No matter what kind of monster it was, oxygen was indispensable. Perhaps they could lose oxygen for a long time, but it was impossible to lose oxygen permanently. The reduction of oxygen was bound to cause dizziness, weakness, and other symptoms. Hiss! The little splitter that was pressed by the stone struggled to turn over its body. It slowly crawled back. It seemed to be afraid and angry as it looked at Dean. Dean saw the appearance of the two little splitters. He knew that they were extremely weak. He could even defeat them in close combat. However, he wouldn't jump down and fight them in close combat. He continued to fan the smoke and waited. An hour passed in the blink of an eye. The two little splitters tried to rush out of the smoke-filled cave several times, but they were knocked back by the stones thrown by Dean. Every time they failed, it would result in a loss of physical strength. The two little splitters gradually gave up the plan to rush out of the cave. They retreated to a lower part of the cave where the smoke was slightly lower. Dean looked at the two little splitters that were dying. He secretly sighed in his heart. Who would have thought that a mere smoke could push the legendary monsters to this point? Even if they were in their infancy stage, they were at level 24 or 25. The Black Weaver that Glenn had killed was only a level 26 existence. Dean threw two small stones from time to time towards the two little splitters. The two little splitters resisted at first, but later they lay on the ground and let Dean throw stones at them. They didn't resist at all. Seeing this, Dean was relieved, but he still continued to fan for about 10 minutes. When he stopped, a large amount of smoke came out of the hole. Obviously, the capacity inside was already saturated. Dean jumped into the cave after the smoke came out a little. He pulled out the dagger from his waist. He turned around and picked up a big stone from the ground. He bent down and quietly approached the two little splitters. The two little splitters did not move. He walked more than 10 meters away, raised a big stone and threw it at one of them. Bang! The big stone smashed into the little splitter's body. The sharp pain woke it up, but it didn't jump up. Instead, it struggled to turn over its body. The movement of its blade-like limbs was incomparably slow. It seemed that lifting it was extremely difficult. Dean didn't hesitate to pull out an arrow from the quiver. He aimed and shot at the core of the splitter's body. He pulled the rope and slowly dragged the splitter's body away from the other splitter. The little splitter was weaker than Dean had imagined. It just twitched a little but didn't resist. Dean waved the dagger to cut the joints of its blade-like limbs. Puff! The joints were stabbed. The little splitter screamed in pain and waved its other blade-like limbs to cut Dean. Dean easily bent down to avoid the stab. He grabbed the limb that was stabbed in the joint and pulled it out. With a splash of blood, the blade-like limb was pulled out forcefully. The little splitter screamed in pain. Its sharp limbs were like an iron ball. Dean was forced to retreat. He waited for the little splitter to stop. He approached it and continued to attack the other sharp limbs. Splitter's limbs were pulled out by Dudian after a few minutes. Its body was like a huge peanut-shaped insect. Its surface was covered with a layer of dark carapace. It was like an armor protecting its body. Dean didn't pay attention to it. He continued to attack the other little splitter. 5 minutes later, the second little splitter was also pulled out by Dean. It lost the ability to fight. Dean gasped for a moment and jumped out of the cave. He took a few deep breaths of fresh air to replace the smoke in his lungs. He went back into the cave and tied up the 2 little splits that had lost their fighting ability. He dragged them to the corner of the cave and looked inside. The scene inside was almost the same as the last time he saw it. There were still piles of corpses that were 7 or 8 meters high and the ground was covered with blood. There were all kinds of monsters on the pile of corpses, but he did not look carefully. He quickly went around the pile of corpses and immediately saw the nest behind it. There were a few giant eggs lying in the nest. He went closer and found that these giant eggs were even taller than him. He circled the nest and counted them. His eyes widened and were filled with surprise. 5? There are 5 more? Plus these 2, isn't there a total of 7? If you count the one in the inner wall, then there are 8. 8 legendary monsters. How could he not be excited? It meant that he could increase the probability of deification of the splitter to 70%. With such a high probability, it was completely worth it. Dean sighed and turned to the pile of monster corpses next to the nest. He looked around but didn't see any named monster's corpse. He couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. Then he thought that the named monster's corpse had parasitic soul worm. This thing should be a great tonic for Great Splitter. After all, humans relied on parasitic soul worm to improve their magic mark's ability. Most monsters would also need it. Dean looked at the 2 little splitters. His eyes flashed for a moment. He grabbed 2 corpses of the Tibetan Mastiff and threw them in front of the 2 little splitters. The 2 little splitters saw the food. They wriggled their bodies and moved closer to the food. But they didn't have sharp limbs, so it was very difficult for them to eat with their mouth. Dean didn't care about this. He didn't continue to stay in the smoke. He returned to the outside of the cave. He thought, the cruel predation of the monster world has created the living areas of the monsters. Just like the giant wall is divided into 3 areas: the poor, the people, and the merchants. Most of the monsters in this area are level 20 to 35. The splitter chose to lay eggs here because the monsters here are weak. It's not easy to hurt its children. Moreover, its children can have a more suitable living environment after leaving the cave. Among the monsters around level 20 to 35, there are 2 types of monsters that like to hunt for the young and eggs of other prey. The first is the brown spider fly, which is level 21. It is short and extremely sensitive to the smell of monsters that are about to give birth. It likes to follow these monsters and wait for the opportunity to hunt for the young or eggs that they lay. The second one is the widow frog. It doesn't only like to eat the eggs or cubs of other monsters but also its own cubs. So every female widow frog will stay away from the male widow frog when they are pregnant. They regard the male as the natural enemy of the beast. Dudian raised his head and looked around. The terrain here is dry. It should be the suburbs of the city. There are many hills. Frogs like to appear in humid areas, so there shouldn't be any nearby. But we have to guard against spider flies. There are a lot of them, and their weakness is obvious. They are afraid of large monsters. They don't dare to attack any large monsters. They are a typical bully. Splitter won't dare to attack even if it's a juvenile. I don't need to set up traps to guard against anything. I just need to be careful of other beasts. Don't be attracted by the smell of blood in the cave. He came to the cave and moved the boulders to block the hole again. He looked around but didn't see any movement. He quickly turned and left. I don't have much time. I have to raise this place as soon as possible. Splitter has been hunting nearby recently, so no monsters dare to come close. But as time goes on, there will inevitably be monsters migrating over and breaking into the forbidden area, Dean thought as he returned. He walked and stopped along the way. He bypassed some strange smells and smoothly returned to the body of Splitter. As soon as he jumped into the subway, he saw a huge sickle walking dead, gnawing on the body of Splitter. His face sank. Previously, not all the walking dead in the subway were killed, so there were a lot of them left. This walking dead was probably the bravest monster among all the monsters. Even in the face of Splitter, it dared to attack. At the moment, the body of this sickle undead was much bigger than ordinary undead. It was nearly 3 meters tall. The muscles of its whole body were bulging. It was extremely bloated. The clothes that were about to be fibrous burst open. Only a few dirty fibers were left. Fortunately, there were still some pants hanging on its butt. Dean could recognize that it was the undead from the subway. The sickle undead also noticed Dean when Dean was looking at it. It roared and rushed toward Dean. Dean's eyes were cold. He immediately put an arrow and aimed at its forehead. Puff! The arrow suddenly flew. This undead had the same physique as the mutated sickle undead that Dean had encountered before. However, facing the arrow, it didn't have the slightest consciousness to avoid. Puff! The arrow suddenly went into its head, and its huge body crashed to the ground. Dean was slightly startled. He didn't expect it to be so easy to solve. He knew that the undead would not pretend to be dead. He immediately jumped over when it didn't move. He saw that the muscles on its body were bloated and hard. It was like stepping on a stone. The muscles were covered with blood-colored tubes. The luster was bright, as if it was going to burst out of the muscles. Roar! When Dean was observing, another roar came from the other side of Splitter's body. It was another undead that was as huge and bloated as this one. Dean's face changed slightly, and he quickly pulled out the arrow. As soon as his hand touched the quiver, he found that there were not many arrows left in the quiver. He grabbed an arrow, put it on the quiver, quickly aimed, and shot out. Puff! The arrow swept in a straight line and accurately hit the undead's forehead. Chapter 338. Dean frowned and raised his hand to pull out the arrow from the forehead of the bloated undead. This arrow was just an ordinary fine iron arrow. Using mercury-poisoned arrows to hunt undead was a complete waste. Moreover, there were not many mercury-poisoned arrows left in his quiver, so he had to use them sparingly. In this silent subway, the roar of the two bloated undead was extremely loud. When the second bloated undead fell under the arrow, there was another roar. He saw from behind the body of the huge Splitter, 2 more bloated undead came out. One of the bloated undead was cut off from the chest, leaving only the upper body swollen. Its face was full of bulging flesh and blood. The mouth and eyeballs were squeezed into the flesh, like a balloon filled with air. Dean saw the appearance of the half of the undead. He didn't expect that it would evolve because of the flesh and blood of the Splitter. Was it not the stomach that it used to digest food? Was it other organs? Or any tissue of the whole body? This idea passed quickly in his mind. He raised the arrow in his hand and quickly aimed to shoot. Puff! Puff! 2 bloated undead were pierced by the sword and nailed to the ground. Dean saw that these bloated corpses had no intelligence, and his heart was relieved. Although their speed after being bloated was much stronger than the general ordinary corpses, even more than the level 9 scythe corpses, close to the level 15 monsters, but they did not know how to avoid the danger, but became his own live target. Roar! Roar! From the body of the Splitter, the bloated undead climbed out one after another. They roared and rushed to Dean. Dean quickly pulled out the arrow and shot it. After shooting one, he quickly rushed over to pull out the arrow and recycle it. In a blink of an eye, in just 4 or 5 minutes, 14 or 15 undead from the Splitter's body were all shot dead by Dean. 2 arrows were scrapped in the repeated recycling. There were only 4 ordinary arrows and 2 mercury poison arrows left. Dean saw that there were no bloated undead crawling out. He immediately pulled out the dagger and bent down to cut the head of the undead, whose gender was difficult to distinguish. He saw that the swollen flesh outside the skull was extremely hard, like steel. The dagger cut into the skull and dug a small hole along the hole in the neck. He skillfully pulled out some intracranial tissue. Soon, he found a dark blue crystal in a relatively cold intracranial tissue. Dean picked up the cold crystal. It was about half the size of the ordinary undead. It was closer to the cold crystal in the skull of the sickle undead. He guessed that if these bloated undead lived for a while, the nutrients in their bodies would promote the size of the cold crystal to become bigger. According to his previous experience of absorbing cold crystal, the bigger the cold crystal was, the purer the color was, and the more obvious the absorption effect was. These cold crystals can be worth 2 to 3 ordinary undead. Dean's eyes flashed for a moment. He suddenly thought of something. He couldn't help but shine. The flesh and blood of the splitter contains rich energy. These ordinary withered undead trapped in the subway can evolve like this in such a short time after eating its flesh and blood. If these flesh and blood are given to the splitter to eat, won't it soon promote their body to enter the growth period? Thinking of this, he suddenly became a little excited. He quickly collected the cold crystals in the skulls of more than a dozen swollen corpses on the ground. Then he looked around the subway to see if there were any living corpses that he missed. Soon, he found several corpses that fell on the subway track. He killed them and picked up the cold crystals. After confirming that there were no living undead left, he returned to the splitter and thought about how to carry its flesh and blood to the splitter's cave. If he directly cut it and carried it, the flesh and blood would exude a tempting smell. He didn't know how many monsters would covet it along the way. Although the splitter was able to intimidate everyone when it was alive, the smell emitted by its corpse after death was like a sumptuous feast to these ordinary monsters. I have to go back to the giant wall and find some transport tools. Now it's evening and the temperature is getting low. Monsters like to come out to hunt. It's too dangerous to carry at night. I have to go back and prepare the tools. Dean looked at the huge body of the splitter and turned to go out of the underground subway station. Although the body of the splitter would inevitably attract nearby monsters, but he didn't have the tools to cover the smell. He had to abandon it for the time being. After all, it wasn't like there was a pillow sent to him when he dozed off. However, due to the structure of the splitter's body, these monsters could only gnaw its flesh and blood. They couldn't hurt its sharp limbs. These sharp limbs were the most valuable material of its body. They could be forged into extremely powerful hunting weapons. It was completely different from the steel weapons used by other ordinary hunters. Whoosh! Dean quickly ran in the direction of the giant wall. After a moment, he returned to the giant wall. He looked up and saw that Nicholas was still on the giant wall. He was holding the edge of the giant wall and looking down. He was stealthily approaching, so the latter didn't notice him. He ran a few steps and came to about 3 kilometers away from the giant wall. He showed himself and waved his hands at Nicholas on the giant wall. Soon he attracted Nicholas's attention. If Dean died, he didn't know what kind of trouble he would face. Today, he naturally knew the significance of Dean to him. If Dean died, he wouldn't be able to gain freedom. On the contrary, if Dean died, the magistrate would investigate carefully with Dean's prominent identity. At that time, the blame would be put on his head. He was just a criminal in Thornflower Prison. If he lost Dean, he would have no background to rely on. He would be sent to prison again by the forces that Dean had a good relationship with. Dean saw that Nicholas had noticed him and immediately gestured to him. Nicotine's face slightly changed as he saw Dean's gesture. He looked down at the giant wall and felt a burst of dizziness in his mind. His face turned pale. He had been waiting here for a long time. First, he was afraid of heights. Second, he was worried that the beast would come back again when he was halfway up the wall. He would become a conspicuous bait when he was hanging in the air. He hesitated in his heart and wanted to use a gesture to ask if he wanted to take other things with him. Suddenly, he woke up and his face showed a trace of bitterness. From Dean's position, he understood that the latter was afraid of him shooting shark spears from the giant wall, so he stood thousands of meters away. But he knew that he would not do that. Sighing in his heart, he knew that there was no room for explanation, so he tightened the rope on the edge and checked it again. After confirming that there was no problem, he clenched his teeth and climbed up the giant wall. He grabbed the rope with both hands and slowly slid down. Dean quietly watched him. When he reached the height of 700 or 800 meters, he immediately rushed towards the giant wall. By this time, Nicholas had slid down to about 500 meters. He waited for a few minutes. Nicholas slid down from the rope. His old face was as white as paper. His legs were trembling as he landed on the ground. It seemed that he was scared. Dean smiled in his heart when he saw his appearance. He realized that a cunning person was no different from an ordinary person in the face of his own weakness. "You've worked hard. Go back." Dean patted his shoulder and said to him like an elder talking to a junior. He didn't consider the age gap between them. He turned around and opened the door on the ground. Nicholas was surprised for a moment. He quickly jumped into the passage. He saw Dean walking in front of him. He couldn't help but ask, "What about the beast?" "It's dead." Dean didn't look back as he said in an understated tone. He felt helpless and depressed in his heart. He had prepared for so long, but in the end the people from the inner wall easily got the fruit. Fortunately, there were some eggs left in the nest, otherwise he would have suffered a big loss and would have made a wedding dress for others. Dead? Nicholas was stunned. He suspected that there was a problem with his ears. Dead? Such a huge and malevolent monster was killed just like that? Chapter 339. After a moment, Dean and Nicotine came out of the passage. There were 2 teams of Knights of Light on both sides of the passage. There were 2 teams of Knights of Light patrolling in the distance. The 2 teams of Knights of Light were stunned when they saw Dudian and Dudian coming out of the passage. But then they were pleasantly surprised. The middle-aged knight who had talked to Dean before came over. "Architect Dean, you finally came out. We were almost scared to death." Dean was surprised and immediately thought of the reason, but still asked, "Why?" The middle-aged knight replied, "There was a commotion outside not long after you came in. It must be the giant monster that was active outside the giant wall. Fortunately you didn't meet it at that time or we would have suffered a big crime." Dean smiled. "We were far away at that time. I heard the commotion too. Fortunately we were fast enough or we would have to sneak back through the passage." "Yes." The middle-aged knight had a look of lingering fear. If Dean had died outside the giant wall, then the temple would have punished him. Even if it wasn't a heavy punishment, it would affect his career prospect. His competitors would attack him. Dean said, "It's getting late. We have to go back. I'll trouble you to arrange it." "Yes." The middle-aged knight was very polite. He waved to a young knight. "Send a message." The young knight immediately took out a whistle and blew it. From time to time a black crow would come and bring the message to the guard. While waiting, the middle-aged knight chatted with Dean. If he could climb up Dean's tree, his status in the temple would undoubtedly improve a lot. He might even be promoted again. Dean naturally didn't give up this opportunity. In the process of chatting, he learned the name of the middle-aged knight. Charlemagne was a member of the Charles family. The Charles family was a small aristocratic family that belonged to the Huasheng consortium. Charlemagne should be the most promising member of the Charles family. The prosperity of the entire family was on his shoulders. Because of his identity as the captain of the temple's knights, the Charles family had gone from decline to prosperity. Although they were still in the bottom of the aristocratic circle, but they were much stronger than most of the lower-level aristocrats. Many aristocrats didn't dare to look down on Charles' family because of his identity. The number of rich businessmen coming in and out of the Charles family was dozens of times higher than before. The people from the guard have come. Let's talk later. Dean smiled at Charman as he saw the prison carriage coming. Charman was happy to see that Dean didn't have the slightest arrogance. The whole process of the conversation was relatively smooth for him. This was undoubtedly a good foundation for him. As long as he was careful in the future, he would be able to shorten the distance between him and Dean. If he could attend some parties with Dean, then people would know that he had some relationship with Dean. His future would be more smooth and brilliant. Well, Architect Dean, do you need me to accompany you? Charman asked in an affectionate manner. Dean smiled as he knew that the other party was a bit impatient. But he wouldn't let the relationship between them get too close. At present the other party would get the benefits if the relationship between them was too close. So he had to create some difficulties for the other party so that they would know how to cherish and revere each other. He said, "You have to stay here. I'm sorry if I delay your work." Charlemagne replied, "There won't be a big problem as long as they are on duty here. After all, this is a radiation zone. There are mutated beasts here. If you are disturbed, it will be a huge loss for the entire Temple of Elements and the people inside the giant wall." Dean shook his head. "It's almost night time. The monsters outside the giant wall will come out. It's easy to get into an accident. It's safe to have you here. The knights will protect me. Moreover, I have the hunter to accompany me. It'll be easy to deal with the mutated beast." Nicholas was a shrewd man. He could see at a glance that Dean and the middle-aged knight were calculating. He felt that the youth was a cunning old fox. Nicholas was afraid of him. He immediately said, "Don't worry. I'll protect Architect Dean. I won't let the beasts disturb him." The middle-aged knight didn't insist anymore. He knew that the status of the middle-aged knight would drop. He said, "Architect Dean, be careful on the road." Dudian nodded and said goodbye to him. He and Nicholas got into the car and went to the guardian's office. After a moment, the two arrived in front of the temple. Dean followed the Knights of Light into the prison cell. He said to the leader of the Knights of Light, "I'm an architect of the Temple of Elements. This is my identity token. Please help me inform the leader of the temple that Dean is here to see me." The Knight of Light was surprised when he heard the first half of Dean's words. But when he heard Dean's name he was stunned. "Are you the architect who created the military crossbow?" Dean nodded. The leader of the Knights took Dean's medal. He saw the word Dean on it. He knew that Dean wasn't lying. He humbly said, "I didn't expect you to be Architect Dean. I didn't know you before. I'll inform you." Then he quickly turned and left. Nicholas was already used to the knight's awe. He turned his head and looked at the surrounding cages. He curiously asked, "Is this the place? I heard that hunters have to stay here for 7 days before they can go back." Yeah. Dean nodded. "I'm bored. Take a look at the books on the table to purify your mind." Nicholas looked down and saw the Holy Scripture of Light, but he didn't take it. He curled his lips and said, "I don't know how many times I've heard the prison guards recite it. If they wanted to purify it, they would have done it long ago. The God of Light can only save people who live under the sun. How can he save people like us who live in darkness and abyss?" Dean glanced at him. "Don't add the word us. I'm not targeting you. I've already said that I'm different from garbage like you." Nicotine smiled as he heard Dean's blunt words. "You are an architect. Naturally you are different from ordinary people like us." Dean chuckled. He didn't explain anything as he sat on the bed and waited. After a moment, the leader of the Knights pushed open the door of the underground cell. He was followed by a handsome middle-aged man. The beard on his face was very clean. His skin was incomparably white and his eyes were bright. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that he was a young man in his 20s, but the mature taste on his face betrayed his age. The handsome middle-aged man was followed by 2 Knights of Light. Their temperament was deep and restrained. Their eyes were sharp. Are you Architect Dean? The handsome middle-aged man came to the front of the cell. He was surprised to see Dean. He didn't expect that the youth who had been frequently reported in recent times would be younger than he had imagined. Dean smiled. I am. Can we talk in private? The middle-aged man stared at Dean for a moment. He waved his hand to signal the people around to leave. He smiled as all the Knights of Light left the cell. Architect Dean, this is the first time we meet. What do you want to say? Dean smiled. In addition to admiring you, my biggest purpose is to ask you for help. Help? The middle-aged man's eyes lit up. Do you want me to cover up the fact that you are out of the giant wall? There is nothing to cover up. Dean shook his head. I want you to release me after the inspection and allow me to return to the city. The middle-aged man shook his head. It's not that I don't want to help, but this matter. I'll do you a favor, how about it? Dean interrupted him and said directly. The middle-aged man was startled. He was a member of the Holy Church, so he naturally paid more attention to the matters of the Temple of Elements. He knew about Dean's recent deeds. In fact, most of the people who weren't members of the Holy Church had heard of Dean's deeds. After all, every time a new invention came out it would cause a great sensation and people couldn't help but pay attention to it. The middle-aged man was in a dilemma. Favor was a big thing, but it was also a small thing. Dean saw that the middle-aged man didn't trust him. I don't know which consortium is behind the director. I haven't sold the lightning rod that I made last time. If it is convenient for you. Chapter 340. Middle-aged man's heart was boiling, but he deliberately hesitated. Architect Dean, this is against the law. If it is spread out. He didn't say anything as he wanted to leave some leeway. Dean narrowed his eyes. I'm an architect of the Temple of Elements. I didn't leave the giant wall this time. I was entrusted to escort Mr. Hunter to the outside of the giant wall. After the physical examination, it was confirmed that there was nothing wrong with my body, so I should be released. Do you want to treat me like a hunter? Middle-aged man's face slightly changed as he heard Dean's words. He thought that Dean would keep it a secret so that both of them would stand on the same boat. He didn't expect Dean's attitude to be so tough. He smiled. Architect Dean's words are too serious. These hunters naturally can't be compared with you. I'll order people to change to a clean room for you. As for the early release, you are an architect of the temple. It would be a loss to the temple and disloyal to the Holy Church if you stay here. I'll order people to send you back after the physical examination. He paused and stared at Dean. It would be great if you could sell your lightning rod to the Scott Consortium of the Church. Dean didn't expect that the person behind the director was from the Scott Consortium. Although he expected the 6 consortiums and Holy Church to infiltrate each other, but he didn't expect that the Scott Consortium would be able to buy the director. This was an excellent chess piece, as he was in charge of the life and death of the hunters. He was in charge of the hunters' life and death. He had high authority and great role. The Scott Consortium has such a deep foundation, but they can only fight evenly with the Mellon Consortium. These consortiums have been operating for decades and their forces are spread all over the place. It would be too slow to cut them off one by one. I can only use force to break them. Dean's eyes lit up as he calmly looked at the director. I have cooperated with the Scott Consortium many times. I believe that the cooperation of the lightning rod will be very pleasant. I haven't asked your name yet. Divine Emissary Du is too polite. I am Lemvi. The middle-aged man was happy and excited. Releasing Dean ahead of schedule was a trivial matter for him. Even if Dean didn't use the lightning rod as a bargaining condition, he was willing to make friends with an architect with extraordinary potential. Moreover, he would be able to share the wealth of the Scott Consortium. Moreover, he would be able to improve his own status. It was a bargain for him. Dean nodded and wrote down the name. Thanks for the trouble. He sat back on the bed. Lemvi laughed as he saw Dudien's intention. I'll arrange someone to come over and give you a physical examination. But before that, I'll change your room. It's too dirty here. No, the residence is just a worldly possession. Don't worry about it. Dudyan calmly replied. Lemby looked at the youth with interest and said, Since that's the case, I'll take my leave first. With that, he turned around and left the cell. Nicotine silently observed everything. He looked at Dean after Lemby left. Master, won't you take me back with you? You will wait here for 7 days before going back. Dudyan indifferently said, My early return will arouse the attention of some forces. If we go back together, then the target will be bigger. In addition, I'll come back right after I go back. Be careful with your words and don't talk nonsense. Nicotine heard his warning. I will. Master, I made a mistake in the past, but I will be absolutely loyal to you from now on. I hope you can trust me once again. I only look at the performance. Dudyan indifferently replied. Nicotine wryly smiled but didn't say anything. After a moment 2 doctors came in and gave Dudyan a physical examination. They left after the examination. They didn't pay attention to Nicotine, who was on the other side. The next day, Dudyan sat in a carriage. He was escorted by a team of Knights of Light to a nearby fortress. The reason for sending this team of Knights of Light was that the barbarians in the radiation zone had been active recently. They were worried that they would hurt Dean. If Dean fell, the sinners would naturally be counted as his head. Therefore, they had to take care of Dean carefully. At the same time, they hoped to increase Dean's goodwill. With the intelligence network of the Luminous Church, the group chose a route that had fewer savages. Along the way, they were attacked by a few mutant beasts, but they did not encounter any savages. They returned to the fort without any trouble. Dudyan directly went back to his castle with the carriage of the Holy Church. The carriage moved at a fast speed. Some carriages of wealthy merchants saw the flag of the Holy Church on Dudyan's carriage. They moved to the side of the road and didn't dare to block the road. A few hours later, Dudyan returned to the castle. He saw Jean sitting in the hall. Where are the 2 of them? Jean was sitting cross-legged while peeling fruit. He was shocked as he saw Dudyan come back. He almost cut his fingers. He stood up and said, Young master, they are at home. Gwyneth is upstairs. Sergei is at the training ground. Dudyan immediately said, Call them over. Yes. Jean turned and ran away. It didn't take long for Gwyneth, Sergei and Jean to appear in the hall. Dean was drinking tea to replenish the lost water in his body. He immediately ordered, Sergei, go and buy a batch of things to make hunting traps. Here are the gold notes. He threw a stack of gold notes on the table. Sergei was surprised. Are you going outside the giant wall again? Didn't you just come back? Why are you talking so much nonsense? Dudyan squinted at him. Sergei went forward to pick up the gold notes and left the hall. Dudyan looked at Gwyneth. Go and buy some weapons for you and my arrows. Also buy some ropes for hauling. Gwyneth nodded and took the gold note. She silently left the castle. Dudyan looked at Jean. Go and hire. Forget it. Go and buy a carriage and prepare to haul things. Old Jean was slightly startled, but he still nodded in agreement. Dudyan turned to Crone after the 3 left. We will go outside the giant wall again. You will take care of the house. Cut out any news in the next 2 days and give it to me when I come back. Yes, master. Crone nodded respectfully. After entering the castle, he learned the attitude of Gwyneth and the others. He didn't dare to overstep his boundaries. He felt a familiar and strange feeling from Dean. He grew up in the same orphanage as Dean. The distance between them seemed to be getting bigger and bigger as Dean's identity got bigger and bigger. Crone didn't dare to treat Dean casually. Moreover, Dean was talking with Sergei, Jean and others in the castle. They specifically talked about Dean's trip to the outside of the giant wall. In the past he had some yearning for the outside of the giant wall, but after listening to Sergei and Jean, he knew how dangerous it was to go to the outside of the giant wall. At the same time he understood that this companion of his, who grew up in the same orphanage, was able to achieve the achievements he had today because of countless life and death experiences. This made him have an indescribable complex mood. Another cup. Dudian handed him the cup. Crone took it and immediately filled it up. Dudian's fingers gently tapped on the table as he looked at the distant view outside the castle. A few hours later, Jean was the first to come back. He drove a carriage and stopped by the Tyza River outside the castle. Dudian saw Jean jump down from the carriage. No coachman? Chapter 341. Smart. Dudian smiled and praised. Old Jean was overjoyed and smiled humbly. I learned it from young master. I don't know how to flatter. Dudian smiled. Jean's face turned red as he scratched his head. After a moment, Sergei and Gwyneth came back with a team of carriages loaded with a lot of goods. Master, we have bought everything. This is extra money. Sergei came over and handed a stack of gold and silver bills to Dudian. Dudian nodded but didn't take it. Crone, who was standing behind him, understood what Sergei meant. He came forward and put away the money. Get ready to load the goods. Dudian ordered. Okay. Sergei nodded and turned to the workers of the Chamber of Commerce who came with the convoy. Mel family. Castle. Office on the first floor of the building. Sarah Mel was sitting in the spacious office. She was quietly listening to the report of a handsome youth in front of her. She nodded after he finished. He didn't leave the giant wall. Is he really ready to give up his identity as a hunter? By the way, didn't you investigate the driver of the beast carriage that transported him there? He should know something, right? The youth bowed his head. The coachman was attacked by a mutant beast on the way back. The patrolling Knights of Light were aware of it. His body was bitten by the beast. The rescue was ineffective and he died. Sarah Mel was startled. Attacked by a mutant beast? Didn't he have a Knight of Light escort him back? The youth shook his head. No. Stupid. There was a trace of anger in Sarah Mel's eyes. She suddenly thought of something. Are you sure that he was attacked by a mutant beast? It wasn't man-made? I'm sure. The youth bowed. I have sent people to check his body. There are no human scars on his body. All of them were claw marks and teeth marks of mutant beast. Sarah's eyebrows wrinkled, her eyes were cold. Stupid civilians, death is not enough. Scott Consortium. Council Hall of the Consortium headquarters. Chastov looked around at the crowd. I have good news to tell you. The latest 4-star high-quality lightning rod has been sold to the Scott Consortium. In addition to sharing this good news, I also want to inform you that the consortium's funds will be transferred to the production of the lightning rod. We don't know the cost, but it won't be small. Currently the consortium is short of funds, so we will be recruiting wealthy businessmen to join us in the production of the lightning rod. We need to make the lightning rod as soon as possible before the rainy season. We have enough goods so that we can use the lightning rod during the next rainy season to earn enough funds for the mining project. The consortium members on both sides of the long table looked at each other. Some were pleasantly surprised, some were skeptical, and some were worried. One of the middle-aged men said, Chairman, didn't Architect Du say that he would consider selling after the black snow season? Why did he suddenly agree to sell it to us? Chistov looked at him. Speaking of this, I have to thank Rosie. She went to Architect Dean's castle many times and used her excellent diplomatic skills to negotiate this matter. Everyone couldn't help but look at Rosie, who was sitting at the other end of the long table. She had a smile on her face and a calm expression. Miss Rosie is really a good negotiator. She is indeed a talented woman who has studied in the magistrate. Congratulations! In front of the castle. Dean called Sergei, Gwyneth and Jean to get on the carriage. Before leaving, Dean thought of something and looked at Crone. If the Scott Consortium comes to talk to me about the invention, then tell them to wait for me to come back and we will discuss the details. Tell them to prepare the gifts. Crone was startled. Yes, master. Dudian nodded and sat on the head of the mammoth. He looked at Jean, who was holding the rope. "Let's go." Old Jean nodded and drove the mammoth carriage to the special road for beast carriages, heading towards the fort. They arrived in front of the fortress after a few hours. Dudian showed his architect's metal and smoothly entered the radiation zone. They walked for 2 hours before they reached the giant wall passage. Gwyneth and Sergei killed many mutant beasts along the way but didn't meet any barbarians. Dean untied the rope ladder that was wrapped around the mammoth's forehead. He climbed down the ladder and looked at Charlemagne. "It's your duty today. Thank you for your hard work." Charlemagne was surprised as he looked at Dudian. He didn't expect Dudian to be so powerful. Dudian had gone to the Guardian Institute yesterday, and now he was able to bring people out again. Obviously he had left the Guardian Institute. Charlemagne's attitude became more polite. "You are too polite. We are here to serve the residents of the giant wall. It's what I should do." Dudian nodded and pointed to Sergei and the others. "They are hunters of our consortium. They are here to build a stronghold outside the giant wall. These are the materials." Charlemagne glanced at Sergei and the others. "It's a small matter." He turned and waved his hand to signal the Knights of Light to open the passage. Dudian waved to Sergei and the others to move the materials. Sergei, Gwyneth and Jean put away the surprise on their faces as they turned around to move the materials. Jean was the one who was shocked the most. He was a Knight of Light, so he knew the purity and nobility of the Knights of Light. He didn't expect the captain of the Knights of Light to be so polite and respectful to Dean. He was shocked by Dean's means, but he was disappointed and lost. The captain of the Knights of Light had a higher rank than him. Chapter 342. Dudian called Sergei and Gwyneth to bring their weapons and some lighter materials. Sergei was in front of them. If they encountered monsters that Dean couldn't smell, then Sergei's steel dragon, magic marks would be able to save their lives. The three of them came to a place not far from the body of Splitter. Dean gently sniffed and smelled 2 or 3 strange smells gathered around the body of Splitter. His eyes slightly moved as he made a hostile gesture to Sergei. Sergei's heart turned cold. He bent down and held his lance as he slowly moved forward. Although Sergei was sloppy in the giant wall, but he was a different person after he came out of the giant wall. He was silent and vigilant. He noticed the huge scratches on the giant wall and occasionally saw huge traces of destruction along the way. It made his heart tremble. He didn't know what kind of monster Dean was going to hunt. He had been hunting for so many years, but he had never seen such a terrifying monster. Dean looked down from the hole and saw that there were 3 cheetah-like monsters on the huge body of Splitter. They were nearly 2 meters tall and had ferocious fangs. The patterns on their fur were like eyeballs. They were like peacock feathers, which had a deterrent effect on the enemy. The front of their limbs were mutated with protruding bone spurs. They looked like hooked daggers attached to the claws. 100-eyed monster, level 21. Dean's eyes slightly sank as he glanced around. He noticed that there were more corpses of other monsters on the ground. There were jungle lizards, unknown pythons and small insect-like monsters. All of them were dead. He looked at Sergei and Gwyneth. Both of their faces were full of horror. Gwyneth's cheeks were full of shock. In her impression, most of the monsters were the size of the magic claw crocodile. They were considered as high-end monsters. However, the monster in front of her was like a prehistoric monster. It was hard to imagine the scene of a human fighting against it. The most shocking thing was that the monster was dead. The weapon that was stuck in its body was the shark spear that she had personally participated in smelting. Compared to Gwyneth's shock, Sergei was a bit confused. Although the light inside was dim, it didn't prevent him from seeing the appearance of the giant monster. He was shocked when he first saw the huge shadow, but he quickly found out that the giant monster was one of the 8 legendary monsters in the Pyramid of Monsters, Splitter. The scratches on the giant wall were obviously caused by this Splitter, but it was dead. A legendary monster died here. From the faint smell of decay, Sergei could conclude that the time of death was not more than 2 days ago. 2 days ago was the day when Dean went out to hunt. The shark spear on the body was enough to prove this point. His heart was beating wildly. He turned to look at Dean, who was next to him. He was both excited and nervous. Its magic marks should not have been. Dean didn't answer him but looked at the two of them. There are 3 monsters down there. One for each of us. Is there any problem? Sergei and Gwyneth looked at the calm and deep eyes of the teenager. They felt a burst of chill in their hearts. Their attitude towards Dean quietly changed. Sergei responded, "I can barely do it. If I remove the nails on my body, then I can fight 3 monsters by myself." "I'll get the nails for you when we get back," Dean said. Sergei and Gwyneth's heart jumped. They looked at each other. They could see the surprise in each other's eyes. Dean had forbidden them to pull out the nails in order to suppress them. Now he was willing to help them remove the nails. Obviously, it was not because of their loyalty, but because he wasn't afraid that they would regain their strength. Sergei understood what Dean was relying on. His heart was filled with both fear and curiosity. He had only heard about the legendary magic marks in the rumors. He had never seen it before. Was it really as terrifying as the rumors said? While the two of them were thinking, Dean had already pulled out an arrow and aimed at the nearest 100-eyed hellhound. The moment it bit a piece of flesh, he suddenly released the arrow, and with a whoosh the sharp arrow flew out. The dog reacted very fast. When it heard the sound of the arrow, its body suddenly turned sideways and jumped to dodge, but its speed was still too slow. Dean's physique was almost the same as an ordinary senior hunter. At this moment, the distance between them was less than 200 meters. The bowstring was pulled and the arrow's speed reached its peak. When the dog suddenly reacted, it was already a step too late. Puff! The arrow hit its ribs. The 100-eyed monster groaned and fell to the ground. It quickly stood up and glanced around despite the pain in its ribs. Dean had already shot the second arrow when it noticed him. 100-eyed hound saw Dean and the others on the hole, and the arrow flew over, enlarging in its pupils. Its body hurriedly jumped to the left to evade, narrowly escaping the arrow. Dean wrinkled his eyebrows as he saw the sensitive response of the hound. He thought of the catalytic effect of the flesh and blood of the Ripper. The speed of the hound was by no means normal. The color of its fur was red. It was almost the same as a level 25 monster. It was almost impossible for Sergei and Gwyneth to deal with it alone in their current state. "I'll leave the other 2 to you. Sergei, you'd better cooperate with Gwyneth. You can't kill it alone," Dean said indifferently as he put the 3rd arrow on the string. At this time, the other 200-eyed hellhounds also stopped eating when their companion was attacked. They turned their heads and rushed toward Dean and the others who were above the hole. There was a trace of arrogance on Sergei's face as he heard Dean's words. Chapter 343. "What about you?" Sergei asked. Dudian indifferently said, "You just need to do your own thing. I will let you know what you need to know." Sergei was speechless. He didn't ask any more questions. Dudian cut the flesh and blood of Splitter and put them into a folded bag. The bag was specially prepared by him. It had 2 layers inside. One layer was plastic bag and the other layer was cotton thread. It was a relatively advanced wilderness bag. It could cover up the smell of the bag for a long time. Dudian picked up the folded bag and went out of the subway. He told Sergei to take good care of the place. Then he went into the ruins of the grass and quickly left. After 7 or 8 miles he stopped and sniffed. He saw that Gwyneth and Sergei weren't following him, so he continued his journey. More than half an hour later, Dudian came to the cave of Splitter. The cave was still sealed and maintained the previous appearance. Splitter had hunted all the nearby territories. For the time being, no monsters had come close to it. It was relatively safe. He gently moved the boulder and opened a gap. He sniffed the smell inside. He smelled the smell of a small Splitter. It was the same smell as the one he had smelled for the first time. It was the smell of a hatched splitter. He moved the boulder according to the previous hunting method and revealed a gap. At the same time, he sensed the movement of the newborn splitter. He saw that it was behind the boulder. He took a few steps back and threw stones to lure it out. The newborn splitter obviously didn't learn from the two injured brothers in the cave. He quickly climbed to the gap and looked around. Suddenly, a cold arrow was shot at him and hit the eyeball in the core of his body. The angle of the arrow was very tricky. The newborn splitter let out a blood-curdling screech and quickly crawled back into the cave. Dudian ran over and did the same thing. 10 minutes later, the newborn splitter fell under his arrow. Its limbs were cut off. Only the core torso was left. It was tied up in the cave. The other two little splitters were tied together in the cave. The ropes on their bodies were broken. It seemed that the newborn splitter had cut off the rope. Its body rolled to the side of the pile of monsters. It opened its mouth to bite the food on the pile of corpses. The two little splitters screamed as they saw Dudian enter the cave. It seemed that they were extremely frightened. They kept twisting their bodies and moving back away from Dudian. Dudian gently smiled as he threw the bag on the ground. He took out the meat from the big splitter. He cut the meat and threw it in front of the three little splitters. After a moment, the three little splitters relaxed their vigilance. They opened their mouth and swallowed the meat. Dean retracted his gaze and came to the nest. Looking at the remaining 4 giant eggs, there was a trace of heat in his eyes. He raised his hand and gently touched them. The eggs were cold. His heart suddenly moved. He put his ear on one of the giant eggs and listened carefully. After a moment, there was a creaking sound coming from inside the egg. It seemed that something was gently rubbing. "Is it awake?" Dudian's eyes lit up as he gently patted the eggshell. Crack! A crack appeared on the eggshell. But it wasn't the place where Dudian patted. Dudian was surprised as he saw the crack. He quickly retreated a few steps and aimed an arrow. Crack! The crack on the eggshell rapidly expanded. A sharp sickle pierced out from the inside and quickly cut the giant egg. The eggshell cracked and the viscous slurry seeped out. It revealed the shape of a little splitter. Dean's face slightly changed. He was about to let go of the arrow, but he suddenly remembered that there were other giant eggs next to him. In case the little thing was injured, it would break the other giant eggs. The loss would be too great. He immediately retreated. The little splitter squeaked as it saw Dean and ran over cheerfully. Dean quickly shot an arrow as it ran out of the nest. Puff! The arrow hit the core of the splitter's body, which hadn't fully opened yet. The splitter screamed in pain as it stopped moving. Dudian immediately shot an arrow into its mouth. The little splitter rolled on the ground in pain. Its sharp blade left deep marks on the ground. Dudian retreated back into the cave. He held the dagger in one hand as he stared at the little splitter. The little splitter climbed up from the ground and screamed as it rushed towards Dudian. Dudian didn't engage in close combat with it. He returned to the gap in the cave and picked up a boulder to throw at it. Dudian captured the little splitter after a few minutes. He cut off all its limbs and tied it up to the side. He fed it a piece of flesh from the big splitter. Dudian picked up some rotten corpses from the pile of monsters and threw them into the center of the circle surrounded by the 4 little splitters. Dudian squatted down and looked at the little splitter that had been cut off. He found that the wound had scabbed and there seemed to be a new sharp edge coming out of it. Dean suddenly thought of an idea. He secretly noted it down. When he went back, he would ask Jean to prepare some lime powder to completely destroy their wounds, so that they would completely become broken limbs, unable to grow new tissues. However, this method was cruel, but he didn't hesitate as he thought of his great cause. Dudian got up and looked at the remaining 3 giant eggs in the nest. He listened to the movements inside. He found that 2 of the giant eggs were making subtle sounds from time to time. It was obvious that the little splitter had finished its gestation, but it didn't have the ability to drill out of the giant egg. It would take at most 1 day for the little splitter to break out of the shell. He poured the flesh of Splitter in his bag in front of the 4 little Splitters. Chapter 344. In the blink of an eye 2 days had passed. In the past 2 days, Dean had been transporting the flesh of the great Splitter during the day. At night, he had been accompanying Sergei and Gwyneth to guard the corpse of the great Splitter. They had been setting traps to resist other monsters. Perhaps because of the black snow season, the decaying speed of the flesh of the great Splitter was slower. Moreover, the smell of the great Splitter didn't attract the attention of too many monsters. Nevertheless, the 3 of them had encountered 4 or 5 battles in 2 days. Fortunately, the monsters in the vicinity were generally around level 15 to 25. The monsters that were lured over were easily killed under the cooperation of the 3 of them. What made them pleasantly surprised was that there was a monster that had been given a name, Bloody Ripper. This was a ripper in its growth stage, a rare named monster. Its hunting rank was 18, and when it reached the peak of its maturity stage, its hunting rank would be 32. Dean, Gwyneth, and Sergei had successfully killed the Bloody Ripper. They took out the parasitic soul worm and sealed it in a jar that was always prepared by the hunters when they went out. About 7 or 8 tons of flesh had been cut out of the great Splitter in 2 days. All the flesh and blood inside the sharp limbs had been peeled out to prevent the carapace of the sharp limbs from decaying. The flesh and blood had been transported to the great Splitter's cave by Dean. 2 of the remaining 3 giant eggs had hatched. The little Splitter had been injured by Dean as soon as it came out. Dean had used the poison inside the arrow to paralyze the little Splitter. Then he had cut off the little Splitter's sharp limbs so that the little Splitter would lose its fighting ability and become a naked worm. The famous legendary monsters had been turned into 6 naked worms by Dean. They were fed the flesh and blood of the great Splitter. The 6 little Splitters would eat the flesh and blood of the great Splitter when they were hungry. Their appetite had become stronger as they were injured. Each of them would eat 400 to 500 pounds of the great Splitter's flesh and blood every day. The growth of the 6 little Splitters was extremely obvious after they were fed the great Splitter's flesh and blood. In just a few hours they would change their appearance. The growth speed was extremely amazing. In just 2 days they had grown from 3 meters long to 6 meters long. Dean estimated that it would take another 4 or 5 days for them to grow to 11 or 12 meters in length. At that time, they would enter the growth stage and reach the hunting level of 40. However, compared to the other level, 40 monsters, these 6 little Splitters were obviously too weak. Their combat ability was greatly weakened. Moreover, with such rich nutrition, they had completely lost the experience of sharpening their blades every day. Their businesses are doing normal business. There is nothing out of the ordinary. Miss, why do you ask? Sarah's eyes flashed. The barbarians are attacking the Guardian Wall. With the number of barbarians gathered in the Red Maple Mountains, it will be difficult for the military to resist. Once the barbarians break through the gap and rush into the commercial district, the consequences and losses are not something that the army is willing to face. If they want to defend the wall, then they must use the forbidden technique of the army. Sun Flame Magic. Sun Flame Divine Art? Lisa stilled and her expression changed. Is it the Blaze family's Flame Explosion Divine Art? Yes, it's just a different name, Sarah whispered. The flame explosion magic of the Inferno family has repeatedly caused great damage in the commercial district. Later they provoked the magistrate. They sent high-level disciplinary officers from the inner wall to capture them. The momentum of the flame explosion magic was suppressed. I don't know how the military got the recipe of this magic and produced it, but the destructive power of this magic is too strong, so the military didn't dare to use it at will. Now at this critical juncture they must use it. Lisa nodded in realization and said, in that case, the barbarians will definitely lose this battle. Sarah narrowed her eyes and said, we don't need to worry about the outcome of the battle. We can only let the barbarians attack earlier. The sooner they attack, the earlier we will be able to recover our industry. These days, the Scott Consortium took advantage of the barbarians' occupation of the Red Maple Mountains and the decrease in mineral resources. Moreover, they need a lot of weapons and metals. If we don't recover our industry, then our losses will increase. If the battle continues for a month, then even if we recover the Red Maple Mountains, it would be very difficult for us to compete with the Scott Consortium in the mineral industry. Moreover, the war would just end and there would be a surplus of resources. Getting the Red Maple Mountains wouldn't make much sense. Lisa wondered, but miss, how can we make the barbarians attack earlier? We can't command them. Commanding is risky. Luring them is the most reliable method. Sarah gently smiled. We only need to send a few spies to expose the weaknesses of the military to them. They will naturally find a way to attack as soon as possible. Lisa was startled and couldn't help asking, will they believe it? If the news is true, then they will naturally believe it. Sarah's lips curved into a smile. Lisa was taken aback. Her eyes lit up as she lowered her head and said, Mrs. Wise. Chapter 345. Ryan Family. The study room on the second floor. Old Foulin dismissed the maids. Only Sander was in the room. He sighed as he looked at the night sky outside. There was a bit of worry on his face. Sandro, who was serving at the side, could not help but ask when he saw his father's expression, Father, are you also worried about the barbarians' invasion? With the strength of the army, it shouldn't be difficult to defend the Guardian Wall. Even if the army fails, the Holy Church and the magistrate won't just sit back and watch. Besides, if the Guardian Wall falls, we can retreat to the edge of the inner wall and wait for reinforcement. Old Foulin shook his head and sighed. Child, I'm not worried about the war of the army. It's our war. Our war? Sander was surprised. Old Foulin said, War is a disaster, but it is also an opportunity. The 6 consortia are aiming at the huge profits brought by the war. Look at the mineral industry in the market. The price has soared. Unfortunately, they have earned wealth but lost their reputation. Look at the Holy Church and the magistrate. The Holy Church has built prayer platforms in the square. They will pray to God when the war starts. If there is a God, then why didn't he destroy the barbarians? I don't know how much wealth will be donated to the Holy Church by the civilians. As for the evil dark church that gathers potioneers and alchemists, it is very likely that they will push the direction of the war. All the forces are using the hands of the savages to fish for what they need. Only we won't be able to fish for any benefits in such a war. Instead, we will be targeted by other forces and will be taken advantage of by them to destroy. Sander's face slightly changed. Are you talking about the Melon Consortium? Old Foulin sighed. It's hard to avoid disasters, but it's hard to refuse blessings. I hope that the Scott Consortium will draw the attention of the Melon Consortium. Otherwise, in this chaotic period of war, we will become their food. Sander was surprised. Father, aren't your words too negative and pessimistic? We have Dean behind us. The Melon Consortium has been trying to deal with us, but to no avail. The authority of the Holy Church and the Temple of Elements shouldn't be provoked. They shouldn't dare to provoke our anger at this time. Old Foulin smiled. But the problem is that Dean is outside the giant wall. At this critical moment, he didn't stay in the Temple of Elements. I don't know if he deliberately exposed such a flaw to lure the Melon Consortium to attack, or if he didn't consider this point and went outside the giant wall. If it's the latter, then I'm afraid that we will suffer a big loss this time. Sandro was startled. He thought for a moment and said, Father, since the situation is so urgent, should I immediately send someone to call him back? He is outside the giant wall. So how can we call him back? Sander, Jake, and the other children on both sides of the table were stunned. They suspected that there was a problem with their ears. Old Foulin's face sank. What nonsense are you talking about? When did our Ryan family owe you money? Humph. The middle-aged man sneered as he took out a sheepskin scroll. This is the contract. It is clearly written on it. Even if you go to the magistrate, it will be the same. He threw the scroll towards old Foulin. The scroll didn't fall at old Foulin's feet. The middle-aged maid bent down to pick it up and handed it to old Foulin. Old Foulin's face was gloomy as he opened the parchment. He looked at Jake. You unfilial son! How could I give birth to such a thing? You owe me this debt. Old Foulin's face was gloomy as he opened the parchment and looked at Jake. You are an unfilial son! How could I give birth to such a thing? You owe me this debt. Go and pay it yourself. He angrily threw the sheepskin scroll at old Foulin. Jake was startled. He couldn't care less about the knife in his hand and hurriedly caught the sheepskin scroll. He hurriedly flipped it open and his eyes widened. He stood up from his chair and cried out involuntarily, Impossible! When did I ever sign such a contract? Impossible! The middle-aged man seemed to be very happy to see the scene in front of him. He smiled and said, Mr. Jake, don't you remember what you said in the Moulin Rouge in Lido last time? How could you forget it in the blink of an eye? These words were written in black and white by you. Now you want to renege on your debt? Jake felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He rushed in front of him and roared, You framed me! I read the contract at that time. It wasn't like this at all. You are despicable. You are committing a crime. You gave me a fake contract to sign. I will sue you. The middle-aged man touched the saliva on his face and pressed his hand on Jake's chest, pushing him 2 steps back. He tidied up his clothes and said indifferently, Go ahead and sue. I don't need to tell you how to get to the magistrate's court, do I? You. Jake's eyes turned red as he stared at him. Chapter 346. Jake's body trembled in anger. He turned to old Foulin. Father, I was framed by them. Please believe me. I don't have the courage to sign such a contract. The people behind them must be from the Melon Consortium. Old Foulin's eyes moved away from Jake's face as he stared at the middle-aged man. Ryan family will investigate this matter. Please give us 1 day. All right. The middle-aged man said, As long as you sign an agreement here, your family will pay back the money within a day, and I will agree to leave. Otherwise, the ones who should leave should be you. Although this castle is a little shabby, it is still worth some money. Take it as giving me back some of my capital. Father! Sandro hurriedly called out. Old Foulin raised his hand to stop Sandro's words. His wrinkled face revealed a bit of coldness. There was unprecedented chill in his eyes. Don't push your luck. If I expel this bastard from the family, you won't get anything but his corpse. If you want it, then take it. Old Foulin waved his sleeves. He didn't look at Jake, who was in front of him. Jake's face turned pale as he heard these words. He didn't know if he was scared or angry. He knelt down and hugged old Foulin's legs. Father, you can't do this. If you drive me out of the family, then they will definitely kill me. You can't be so cruel. You can't. Yes, Grandpa. Below the dining table, Hughes and another young girl were at a loss as to what to do. They hurriedly knelt down and pleaded for their father. Old Foulin didn't hear them. His face was cold as he stared at the middle-aged man. Middle-aged man's face slightly changed as he looked at old Foulin. Patriarch, you are really courageous. Good courage. His own son and grandson were not even worth this much money. Fine. 1 day. I will give you 1 day. If you can't get the money tomorrow, then get out of here. Otherwise, don't blame me for being impolite. He left in anger. The butler immediately followed them out of the dining room. After a moment, the butler returned and bowed to old Foulin. Master, they have left. Old Foulin's face slightly trembled as he heard Dudien's words. He slowly leaned back on the chair. The murderous aura in his eyes dimmed, as if he had aged 10 years. The hall was silent. Everyone's eyes fell on him. Sandro couldn't bear it and said in a low voice, Father. Old Foulin looked at him. Immediately contact Deacon Antia and ask her to come here. Zendral immediately replied, Yes. He looked at Jake, who was kneeling in front of old Foulin. His eyes flashed coldly, but he didn't say anything. He turned around and left. After a moment, the sound of carriage galloping echoed outside the hall. Jake's face was pale as he clutched old Foulin's trousers. He pleaded, "Father, I was really framed. Please save me. I am your son. You have given everything to him since childhood. I didn't fight for anything. I know that I made a mistake this time. But they deliberately wanted to deal with us, Old Foulin looked down at him. He lifted the crutch in his hand as he wanted to hit Jake. However, he felt a pain in his chest as his hand softened. He took 2 deep breaths as he looked at Jake coldly. Our Ryan family has been destroyed since decades ago. We have been surviving in the crevices. You didn't think about making progress. Now at this critical moment, you have fallen into their trap. Our decades of foundation has been destroyed. Old Foulin coughed again and again as he spoke. The middle-aged maid who was next to him handed him a handkerchief and a cup of tea. Old Foulin took a sip of tea. He looked at Jake. You should pray. If there is no other way, then I will expel you for the sake of the future of the Ryan family. Jake's face was as white as paper. He hugged old Foulin's legs and desperately begged. Hughes and another girl also crawled over. They held old Foulin's other leg and begged. Their faces were full of tears. Old Foulin was indifferent as he saw Hughes and the girl begging. His eyes slightly flashed as if they were moist. At noon, Zendral returned to the castle. All the young masters and ladies of the family were sitting in the hall. They looked at each other. The castle used to be noisy, but at this moment there was no noise. Zendral glanced at the butler. Where are father and third brother? Master is in the study room on the 2nd floor. Jake is kneeling at the door. The butler whispered. Sandro snorted coldly and quickly went upstairs. He immediately saw Jake, Hughes, and his sister kneeling in front of the study. The 3 of them were begging non-stop, and their throats were already hoarse. Jake hurried to look at Zendral. He saw that there was no one behind him. His face turned ugly. Where is Deacon Andia? Why didn't she come? Zendral was too lazy to pay attention to him. He strode over and knocked on the door. Father, I'm back. Come in. Old Foulin's voice echoed from the room. Zendral pushed the door open. Jake quickly got up and wanted to squeeze in. Zendral coldly kicked him in the chest. Jake turned around and locked the door. Old Foulin looked haggard as he leaned against the bed. The middle-aged maid was gently massaging his shoulders. His face slightly changed as he asked, Father, are you all right? Old Foulin asked, She didn't come with you? Sandro gritted his teeth and said, Deacon Andia didn't want to come after hearing about this. She only asked me to pass a message to you. She said that she can't do anything even if she brings this matter to the court. Her only chance is to borrow Oracle dues status and financial resources to pay off the debt in one go. Old Foulin's mouth slightly twitched. What favor? It's bullshit. When our Ryan family was glorious, I had a good relationship with her teacher. Later, I assisted her in ascending to the position of the Ryan family. After so many years, our Ryan family has declined to this point. We have been wronged many times, but I have never asked her for help. Now that we are in trouble, I thought that she would help us because of our past relationship. I didn't expect that people's hearts are colder than I thought. Zendral stepped forward. Father, don't be discouraged. There will be a solution. As she said, we can solve it once Architect Dean comes back. Old Foulin snorted. Do we need her to say such a solution? The Melon Consortium has chosen to be in a difficult situation at this time. Even if he comes back, it won't help. They have been planning this for a long time and have been waiting. Dean asked me before whether the Melon Consortium has taken action or not. At that time we didn't realize it. But now we know that they have already taken action. The treaty has been dragged until now and the interest has risen to an astronomical figure. How can we pay them? Sanders' face changed. Father, is there any reason for them to expose themselves at this time? Is it because the Scott Consortium is pressing them too hard that they are in urgent need of money? Otherwise, the interest will be higher and we won't be able to afford it at that time. Old Fouline's face turned gray. Don't you think that the number of fees is very appropriate? It is the price of a top-grade 4-star item. They are in a difficult situation at this time. Their purpose is to make us bankrupt and cut off Dean's path of retreat. That way they will be able to deal with Dean, who is outside the giant wall. They will frame him like the first time he was imprisoned. Chapter 347. Old Fouline gloomily said, "It's useless. We are too weak compared to a big consortium like the Melon Consortium. They are prepared this time, so they won't leave us with a flaw that can be easily solved. I have carefully read the contract. Even if we sever our relationship with Jake and expel him from the family, the money will still be on our heads. This is the law made by the magistrate. They have already used this loophole to attack us. I wanted to see if he knew about this matter or not. It's not terrible to make a mistake, but I'm afraid it's intentional." Sandro was startled. His expression was somewhat dejected as he said, "Father, is there really no other way?" Old Fouline whispered, "We can only rely on him. I hope that he can return as soon as possible so that we have the strength to fight back. Otherwise," Sanders smiled as he sat on the chair next to him. He pulled his hair in silence. Afternoon. Old Fouline slowly went down the stairs with the help of Sander. He came to the hall. Jake and his children were kneeling in front of the door of the study room. They silently bowed their heads. The people who were sitting in the hall and waiting anxiously saw Old Fouline come out. They stood up and looked at the pillar of the family. Sander's wife slowly stepped forward. She wanted to say something but hesitated. However, she held it back. Old Fouline came down from the wooden stairs and stood on the thick soft carpet. He looked up at all the faces in the hall. There was a bit of trance in his eyes. He slowly said, "Everyone, go back and pack up your belongings. If someone else wants this place, then give it to them. We will go outside for a period of time." There was silence in the hall. Everyone was startled. They didn't expect that Old Fouline wouldn't hand over the responsibility to Jake. Instead, he would bear the responsibility for the entire family. Such a huge debt, coupled with the high daily interest, they would never be able to pay it off. It was just a contract. They would be slaves for generations. The future generations would be burdened with a huge debt. In fact, they would be deprived of their aristocratic status. After a brief silence, some people knelt down in the hall. They cried and begged. "Master, this money is owed by the third young master. It has nothing to do with us. You can't let all of us bear the burden, Master. I beg you to expel the third young master." The hall was filled with cries and wails. Jake and his children, who were standing behind Old Fouline, were shocked and angry. They were afraid that Old Fouline wouldn't be able to withstand their pleas. Their hearts were cold and resentful. They used to live together and eat at the same table. Although they secretly plotted against each other, but it was just a trivial matter. Now they wanted Old Fouline to sever his relationship with them. It was the same as forcing him to the road of death. Jake secretly gritted his teeth and clenched his fists. He hated the Melon Consortium as well as the people who were begging. He hated the genius architect, although the latter brought prosperity and hope to the Ryan family, but at the same time he also brought disaster. He was the victim of this war. He hated it. Old Fouline's face turned ugly as he listened to the pleas in the hall. He lifted his crutch and pounded it on the ground. He stopped all the crying and coldly said, "Get up! Do you think that our family can survive after the expulsion of the third master? The enemy wants to destroy our families and our people, to be destroyed in the dust. Now that the enemy is in the future, you kill each other first. Idiots! Idiots!" Old Fouline was so emotional that he coughed violently. Sandro hurried to support him and caressed his chest. Jake wanted to step forward to support him but was stopped by Sandro's fierce eyes. The people in the hall looked at each other and silently stopped crying. One of the middle-aged women said, "Father, the Melon Consortium wants to deal with the genius architect. It has nothing to do with our family. None of his inventions were sold to our family. We are going to be his scapegoat. Can't you ask him for help? Now that a disaster is coming, why won't he come forward?" Old Foulin was angry as he heard his daughter's words, but coughed again. Sandro comforted her in a few words. At the same time he looked up and shouted, "Shut up! Don't you know the reason? What nonsense are you talking about? First of all, this is the fault of the third brother. What does it have to do with the architect? Secondly, the architect didn't sell his inventions to us because our consortium doesn't have the ability to produce and market such advanced inventions. We are bound to be defeated by other consortia in the market. At present, the architect has gone outside the giant wall a few days ago to build a stronghold for our consortium. He hasn't returned yet. We are going to live in his castle. Do you want our family to be completely destroyed by your nonsense?" The people in the hall were speechless as they heard his majestic roar. The middle-aged woman was startled. She lowered her head and didn't say a word. Old Foulin calmed down and looked at the crowd. There was disappointment in his face as he whispered, "Help me into the carriage." "Yes," Sandro whispered. Sandro returned to the castle to preside over the overall situation after helping Old Foulin into the carriage. He directed everyone to pack their luggage and move. Outside the giant wall, every day, Dean carried out the work of transporting the flesh and blood of the splitter to the cave of the splitter. He monitored the growth of the little splitter. On the third day, the last little splitter was hatched. Dean knocked it down and pulled out its limbs. It lost its fighting ability and became an incubator for the parasitic soul worm. Every day, it fed on the flesh and blood of the splitter to catalyze its growth. On the fifth day, the flesh of Splitter was almost completely cut off by Dean and the other two. Dean moved all of it to Splitter's cave. He told Gwyneth to pick out 5 of the limbs and send them into the giant wall. Then he used his status in the temple to exempt half of the Holy Church's toll. Half of the 5 limbs would be counted as gold coins and would be given to the temple. The rest of the materials would belong to himself. Dean wanted to use the 5 blade-like limbs to create several sets of top hunter equipment and weapons. As for the so-called hunter armors forged by the Temple of Elements, the material was too inferior. Moreover, the armor made from the scales of higher-level monsters was expensive. Most hunters couldn't afford it. Moreover, the defensive power of the armor couldn't be compared with the shell of the splitter. Chapter 348. 6th Day. Master, there is a message from the giant wall. It said that there is an urgent matter. Gwyneth returned to the subway and found Dean. She took out a letter and handed it to him. Dean's eyebrows twitched as he took the letter and opened it. He looked calm as he read it. He burned the letter to ashes with a match, cut the rest of the materials and find a hidden place near the passage to build a hunting base. Sergei, you will be responsible for this matter. I don't need to elaborate on the location and the structure of the base. Of course, Sergei replied. Gwyneth asked, Master, Noyce said that there is an urgent matter. Is it anything important? She was referring to Jin's real name. Dean faintly smiled. It's a good thing. Don't worry. Good thing? There was a trace of suspicion in Gwyneth's eyes. She could see from Noyce's anxious expression that it was not a good thing. Was the situation so serious that Dean deliberately hid it from them? But looking at the calm appearance of the youth, it didn't seem that he was deliberately pretending. Gwyneth was full of suspicions as various thoughts flashed through her mind. But on the surface she was silent. Master, do you need me to write back to them? No, Dean said. Both of you don't need to enter the giant wall for the time being. Gwyneth replied, Yes. Sergei looked at Dean but didn't make a sound. Whoosh. Dean left the subway and went to the cave of splitters. He moved the boulders and entered the cave. He fed the 7 little splitters and then found a flat and dry place to sit down. He leaned against the rock wall and looked at the glimmer of light that penetrated through the boulders. After a long time, his eyebrows twitched. He reached into his backpack and took out a huge cold crystal. It had a blue luster and was relatively pure. He stared at it for a moment, and then bit his left hand to hold the cold crystal. Soon, this cold crystal was melted by his blood. It was like a living mucus that drilled into the wound on his finger. It turned into a thin blue line that flowed along his arm and into his body. Wherever it passed, a cold air quickly spread. It was incomparably cold. A moment later, the cold crystal flowed into his body, and his chest felt cold. The next moment, this cold feeling seemed to scatter, and quickly flowed to every part of his body, causing him to shiver slightly. As the energy of the cold crystal diluted throughout his body, the cold feeling gradually subsided. Dean gradually felt an abundance of vitality bursting out from his body. His eyes seemed to be much brighter. It was as if the air had been washed by heavy rain. It seems that I can continue to improve my physique. Dean looked at his left hand, but I can't continue to absorb anymore. Otherwise my left hand is likely to freeze again. The damage is too great. I should be able to adapt by absorbing 1 a day. He put down his sleeves and looked at the 7 little splitters on the ground. After a few days of feeding, the bodies of the little splitters had grown rapidly. Originally it would take 1 to 2 months to grow to more than 10 meters. But now it only took a few days for them to grow to 8 or 9 meters. He believed that in a few days they would enter the growth period and the larvae of the parasitic soul worms would hatch. Grow, the bigger the better. Dean's mouth curved into a smile. Commercial district. Tyza River. Castle. Mr. Noyce, did you deliver the letter? Old Foulin looked at Noyce as he got up and asked. Zendral, Jake and the others looked at Noyce. Noyce knew that Old Foulin was a noble who had bailed out Dean. He didn't dare to neglect him. Old Patriarch, I have delivered the letter. I believe that it will reach the hands of the young master soon. He should come back as soon as possible if he sees the letter. Old Foulin was relieved. Zendral, Jake and the others were also relieved as they sat back in their chairs. I hope he will come back as soon as possible. Old Foulin sighed. Noyce said, I have sent people to wait at the exit. If there is any news, they will report back. That's good. Thank you for your hard work. Old Foulin nodded. At this time, a brown-haired teenager who was standing on the other side of the castle looked at the clock on the wall. He saw that the time was almost up. He said to Old Foulin and others, Patriarch, there will be distinguished guests coming. Do you want them to leave? Old Foulin looked at the teenager. Distinguished guest? Yes, our young master's distinguished guest. The teenager nodded. Old Foulin looked at Zendral. You go upstairs and be quiet. Yes. Zendral got up and led the way. The rest of the people silently followed. The Ryan family had suffered a great disaster. The whole family was like a frosted eggplant. There was no trace of anger in them. The teenager looked at the servants. Clean up and get ready to welcome the distinguished guest. Yes. After a moment, a carriage stopped in front of the castle. A woman dressed in simple and noble clothes got off the carriage. She smiled at the teenager and Noyce. I heard that Mr. Dean is free today. Why did you inform me to come over to talk about the cooperation of Lightning Rod? The youth smiled. Hello, Miss Rosie. I'm Crone, Mr. Dean's butler. This is our knight Captain Noyce. Please come in and talk about the divine incantation. Rosie politely nodded to both of them. She saw Old Foulin sitting in the hall. Her eyes slightly moved as she smiled. I didn't expect the chairman of the New World Consortium to be here. I was in a hurry, so I didn't prepare a gift. Please forgive me. You are welcome. Old Foulin smiled. He was surprised as he didn't expect that Dean's distinguished guest would be from the Scott Consortium. Moreover, Dean hadn't come back yet. How could he talk about the cooperation at this time? He couldn't help but look at Crone. The latter had stayed in his castle and old Foulin had carefully cultivated him. But now it seemed that it was difficult to see through him. Crone went back to the living room and ordered the servant to make tea for Rosie. He invited her to take a seat. "Miss Rosie, our young master is not here today. He is preparing a new invention. He has already told me about the lightning rod and I have printed the contract. Please have a look. If there is no problem, you can sign it now." Rosie was startled. Her eyes flashed. According to the intelligence of the consortium, she naturally knew what had happened recently. She also knew where the genius architect was now. Therefore, when she came today, she was full of doubts. Now it seemed that the other party had already left a contract, which made her a little surprised. She took the contract from Crone's hand and carefully read it. In addition to the basic terms of the contract, there were several specific treaties. Although it was a bit difficult, but she felt that it was acceptable. After all, this was an extremely important civil invention. After a moment, Rosie looked at Crone and said, "There is no problem with the contract. I didn't expect Mr. Dean to be so bold as to let you, a steward, deal with the upper-grade 4-star item. It seems that he trusts you very much." Her voice was thought-provoking. Crone smiled. "Miss Rosie is too polite. Young master has always trusted us. If you think there are no problems with the contract, then please sign it." Chapter 349. Crone smiled. "Miss Rosie, our young master has already expected your words. He asked me to tell you that if your Scott consortium wants to buy the next item, then you have to buy it at the price of a legendary item. You can go back and discuss it. Time is limited, so please seize the opportunity." Rosie was startled. Old Foulin, who was sitting on the chair, was also startled. Legendary item price? Rosie suspected that there was a problem with her ears or the teenager's mouth. Of course, it was more likely that there was a problem with the architect's brain. Although Dean's prices were getting more and more outrageous, but she was mentally prepared. She wouldn't be surprised if Dean told her that the price of the next item would be at the top of 5 stars. After all, he was a proud genius. However, she didn't expect him to directly raise the price to the legendary level. What was a legendary item? It was a masterpiece of an era. In history, there were very few masters who could create legendary theurgies, let alone the same master who could create 2 legendary theurgies. Such a person could be called a legend himself, and it was very rare. Rosie was startled for a moment before she realized that she had lost her composure. She wanted to criticize the young butler, but she knew that the latter was trusted by Dean. If she offended him, then he might speak ill of her behind her back in the future. She immediately restored her smile. "It seems that Architect Dean is very confident in his new invention. But the price is too high. Although our consortium wants to buy it, but our financial resources can't keep up. It's not that we don't have confidence in Architect Dean, but please forgive us, all right?" Crone smiled. "I'll pass on Miss Rosie's words to the young master." Rosie politely smiled. Although Dean told her to go back and discuss the matter before giving a conclusion, but she knew that the consortium would never agree. The price of a legendary item and a 5-star item were like heaven and earth. Even a big consortium like the Scott consortium would suffer a lot if they wanted to buy a legendary item. Moreover, they hadn't seen the goods yet. If they paid directly, then they would be surpassed by other consortiums. It was a pleasant cooperation this time. "I'll take my leave first." Rosie didn't say anything more and stood up to bid farewell. Crone also got up. A letter appeared in his hand. "Miss Rosie, my family's young master asked me to pass this to you." Rosie took it and was about to open it on the spot when Crone said, "Miss Rosie, I won't send you off." Hearing this, Rosie looked up at him, put away the thought of unraveling it, nodded, and walked out of the living room. Crone and Noyce saw her off. After Rosie left, the two returned to the living room. Old Foulin looked at Crone. "Isn't Dean outside the giant wall? Has the new invention been produced?" Or do you want to use this Miss Chai's mouth to spread this gimmick and increase your reputation? Crone bowed his head and said, I don't know. Young master only told me to do this. He didn't tell me the reason. Old Fourline was startled but didn't say anything. In the carriage. Rosie sat in the spacious carriage. After driving hundreds of meters away from the castle, she took out the envelope from her sleeve. Her eyes flashed as she slowly opened it. Inside was the most expensive snow paper, with a faint fragrance. There were dense and beautiful characters on it, and there was a touch of sharpness in the outline. She read it from top to bottom, and her brows wrinkled more and more tightly. After reading it, she immediately closed the letter. She looked at the air in front of her as she fell into deep thoughts. Mel family. Office in the castle. In the dark and luxurious office, Sarah slowly put down the quill pen. She leaned on the chair in a comfortable position to relieve the pain in her neck. She looked at the short-haired maid Lisa in front of the desk. Are you sure? Yes. Lisa didn't dare to look at her eyes. She lowered her head and said, According to the informant of the Chai family, Miss Rosie went out today to talk about the lightning rod with architect Dean. Sarah gently pinched the quill pen. I heard that he sent people from outside the giant wall. They brought back a batch of high-end monster materials. Old Fourline's letter should have been sent to him. Is there any movement in the passage? No. Lisa bowed her head. Knight Captain Charlemagne, who guards the entrance of the passage, has fallen in love with the young architect. It is not easy to bribe him. But according to an informant we have placed in the team, the architect hasn't returned to the giant wall. The two criminals who were bailed out with him also haven't returned. It is estimated that the letter hasn't been delivered to him yet. Sarah narrowed her eyes. Let people keep an eye on him. If there is any movement, immediately report. Yes. Selling the invention to the Scott Consortium at this time. Humph. He wants to use the Scott Consortium to suppress us when we are short of cash flow. He is really worthy of being able to climb out of the thorn flower prison. His plan is deep enough. He has prepared everything before he left the giant wall. However, we can't destroy the Scott Consortium in a short time. It's easy for us to destroy the New World Consortium. He ran out of the giant wall during this sensitive period. It's tantamount to giving his back to us. If we don't give him a knife or two, then we will be sorry for him. Miss, the newspaper has prepared the article. We will publish it when the barbarians attack. Well, no matter what genius he is, he will become the public enemy of the people. No one can protect him. Outside the giant wall. Splitter's cave. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. It was the 8th day since he came to the giant wall. 7 huge shadows were swaying on the ground. They rolled from time to time. They were the 7 little splitters. However, they were no longer little. After 8 days of nourishment from the flesh and blood of the great splitter, their body had skyrocketed. Due to their incomplete body, their need for food was greater. However, Dean had smeared lime powder on the incomplete parts of their body. It was difficult for them to grow back. Their size had increased rapidly. Fortunately, the cave was big enough. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to accommodate these 7 giants. Dean leaned against the rock wall. He estimated the time. 8 days had passed. Presumably it was time to go back. He turned his head to look at the 7 splitters. Yesterday they had already reached the size of a splitter, but he didn't kill them immediately. Instead, he continued to raise them. In any case, the flesh of these splitters would rot here even if he didn't eat them. Moreover, he still had time, so he was waiting for the moment he needed. Now the right moment had come. He grabbed the bow and arrow and went to the deepest part of the cave. He was more than 10 meters away from the splitter. He pulled the bow and aimed at the splitter. It was a non-toxic arrow, but it was also a deadly arrow. Puff! But the back of his hand was protruding in the shape of a worm, twisting and crawling rapidly along his arm. Dean's face was ugly. He raised his arm, watching the worm in the protruding skin quickly crawling toward him, as if it wanted to enter his brain along his shoulder. Such an illusion made his heart suddenly shiver, and he hurriedly grabbed his throat with both hands, tightly squeezing it. At the same time, he paid attention to the movement of the little worm. He saw it crawling to his right shoulder, straight up along the shoulder collarbone. Although he could not see it from this angle, he could feel the feeling of countless thin feet crawling along the collarbone like a large group of connected ants. This feeling made his hair stand on end, and a large layer of goosebumps arose on his body. Soon, the worm crawled to the throat that was squeezed by his palm, and at the edge of his palm, he could feel the skin below protruding, touching his palm. Dean's face changed. He did not expect that the place this parasitic soul worm wanted to parasitize was his brain. What a joke! He clenched his throat, and the other hand bent and flicked. The protruding skin was flicked, and Dean could feel the disgusting crawling movement through his throat, extending down along his throat, and soon came to his chest. He quickly tore off his shirt, looked down, and suddenly saw a worm in the middle of his chest. The worm wriggled and crawled, but it did not crawl toward the magic mark of the defiler in the middle of his chest, but turned a corner. The direction it was moving toward seemed to be the heart. Dean's pupils shrank, and his heart was filled with anger. What was going on with this parasitic soul worm? It was not the head, but the heart. Both were the core of his body. Once it was damaged, he would die instantly. This was not parasitism, it was simply taking his life. He raised his hand to block the protruding skin, so that the parasitic soul worm could not move forward. At the same time, his other hand had quickly pulled out the dagger. His heart was angry, puzzled, and more frightened. If this thing sank into his body, it would be difficult for him to catch it. He even regretted why he let this thing drill into his body. Or was it that the way he replaced the magic mark was wrong? He was ready. Once this thing sneaked under the skin, he would immediately stab it. Even if he was seriously injured, he had to kill it. After he blocked the way with his palm, the parasitic soul worm hidden under the skin suddenly crawled along the edge of his palm. Dean immediately moved his palm, and wherever it went, his palm intercepted it. After repeating this for a few minutes, the parasitic soul worm under the skin seemed to understand that it was futile to continue. It slowly changed its direction, crawled toward the magic mark of the defiler in the middle of his chest, and slowly sank. Dean was relieved when he saw this, but he had some doubts. Why didn't the parasitic soul worm go to the magic mark of the defiler in the beginning? Instead, it went straight to the two most fatal places on his body, as if it knew in advance that these two places were his vital points. Was it a characteristic of the parasitic soul worm itself? Or was the physical difference between him and the defiler too big? Or was this parasitic soul worm also aggressive? His face was uncertain. He stared at the magic mark of the defiler on his chest. He saw that the red blood vessels of the defiler's magic mark quickly shriveled after the parasitic soul worm crawled over. It didn't take long for the shriveled skin of the red blood vessels to slowly bulge again, but the color was not red, but dark black. At the same time, the shape was not a round blood vessel, but a layer of cuticle-like tissue, and the shape also became a rhombus-shaped triangle. Dean wanted to reach out and touch it, but suddenly felt a little dizzy, and his eyelids were heavy. He was shocked in his heart. He wanted to bite the tip of his tongue to refresh himself, but his thoughts became very chaotic and heavy. Before he could bite the tip of his tongue, his whole body was weak, and he couldn't hold up his eyelids. His eyes turned black, and he fainted. In the darkness, time was in a trance. Dean woke up abruptly. He turned over and sat up from the ground. He hurriedly looked around and saw that the 6 splitters were still lying on the other side of the cave. He was relieved, but soon he was stunned because he found that the bodies of the 6 splitters were emitting fiery red heat, as if there was magma flowing in their bodies, emitting a huge amount of heat. How could the heat be seen? He was startled for a moment, and suddenly thought of something. He looked down and saw that the blood vessels of the defiler's magic mark on his chest had been replaced by a long black, but protruding rhombus-shaped magic mark. He reached out and gently touched it. It was not soft like before, but hard and sharp like a piece of scale. This was the magic mark of the defiler? The replacement was successful? He blinked his eyes and turned his head to look at the 6 splitters again. Once again, he saw the scarlet heat emitted from their bodies. When he looked at the dead splitter beside him, there was only an extremely weak heat emitting from its body. It was like the embers in the ashes that could be extinguished at any time. This is the ability of the magic mark of the defiler? Thermal vision? No, in addition to thermal vision, there is also dark vision. Wait, does it mean that my magic mark of the defiler is still there? Dean's heart jumped. Dark vision was one of the signature abilities of the defiler's magic mark. He looked around and found the dagger that he was previously holding. He immediately used his nails to cut the hilt. The hilt of the dagger was intact without any scratches. Dean was startled. There was some disappointment in his eyes as he smiled bitterly. It seemed that he had thought too much. The dark vision should be one of the abilities of the magic mark of the splitter. Moreover, the dark vision also had thermal tracking ability. No wonder the splitter was able to find the magic claw crocodile that was hiding in the swamp. This is a good tracking ability. It can basically observe all the lurking monsters in the surroundings. Even the cold-blooded creatures are no exception. The cold-blooded creatures also have body temperature, especially the heart. Dean was happy in his heart. His visual organization had been greatly improved. Most of the other aspects had also evolved. However, there was no record of the magic mark of the splitter in the Monster Atlas. There was no way to understand it. He could only rely on himself to slowly explore and observe in the future. He twitched his nose and sniffed the air. Suddenly, he heard a rustling sound, as if countless insects were crawling around him. His expression changed as he looked around, but he didn't see any tiny red shadows. There shouldn't be any insects lurking around him. However, when he sniffed carefully, he could clearly hear a very subtle sound. This sound was very strange. It sounded like countless grains of sand flowing, but also like the sound of water splashing. After more than 10 minutes, Dean finally figured out the source of the sound. It was from the smell. In other words, he could smell the smell. It could also be said that he could smell the smell of the smell. Could this be the extremely rare synesthesia that only appears once in 100 million in medical science? Dean had read a lot of knowledge from the superchip. Naturally, he was most concerned about the medical aspect. Therefore, he knew about the term synesthesia. The symptoms were just like the literal meaning. The human body's senses were mixed up. The reason why he had such a judgment was because he could still hear the rustling sound even when he blocked his ears. Moreover, he could hear it most clearly when he sniffed. My vision has evolved from the original dark vision to night vision and thermal vision. Smell and hearing are mixed up. The range of smell has been reduced. It's not as far as the magic mark of the defiler. But I can smell the sound emitted by the smell. If combined with my ears, the range of smell is equivalent to the range of my hearing. It seems that my perception ability will reach the extreme within my hearing range. Basically, no monster can hide from me. The eyes, nose, and ears have evolved, but the mouth doesn't seem to have changed much. There are changes in the body. My fingernails and toenails have become harder. They are not like human fingernails, but more like metal blades. I haven't found any abnormalities in other parts of the body. After a period of sorting out and sensing, Dean classified his changes. Chapter 351. Dean's figure moved. His boots stepped on the shallow part of the pool of blood, pulled out the arrow, and used the feather of the arrow to pick up the red-hot thing in the pool of blood. His strength was gentle, and a parasitic soul worm similar to the previous one flew out. He took off his clothes and caught it. He opened the jar he prepared in his pocket, poured the worm into it, and then poured the filtered water into it. The parasitic soul worm was soaked in the filtered water, and the blood on its body suddenly dyed the whole bottle red. Dean shook it, opened the jar, bit his finger, and let the blood flow along the mouth of the jar in a straight line to the edge of the jar. After a moment, the parasitic soul worm in the jar slowly crawled out along the blood. Dean reached out to hold it, and the parasitic soul worm fiercely struggled as if it was frightened. 2 small spikes stabbed into his palm, but there was no pain, only a slight numbness. Dean took out the prepared magic liquid syringe, folded it from the middle, stuffed the little thing into the syringe, buckled it, and pushed a section of the syringe into it. The parasitic soul worm seemed to be a little panicked in the narrow magic liquid syringe, and struggled fiercely. Dean pushed the metal handle and immediately pushed the parasitic soul worm to the bottom of the syringe. As he increased his strength, the little thing's body was suddenly squeezed and burst open, turning into a pool of mud. At the same time, the whole of the magic liquid syringe was filled with dark red mucus, almost seeping out. Dean immediately pierced the needle into the magic mark on his chest. The hard magic mark was as smooth as snake phosphor. After piercing several times, it was difficult to pierce a few millimeters. Dean controlled his strength and pushed the dark red mucus in the syringe into the magic mark. The parasitic soul worm in the syringe had long been torn apart, turning into mucus that flowed into the needle and injected into the magic mark. Dean repeatedly pulled the magic liquid syringe several times, completely flattening it into mucus and injecting it into the magic mark. Finally, in the syringe, only the flattened and shriveled skin was left. Dean put away the syringe and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He felt the changes in the magic marks on his chest. There was a feeling of saturation. His whole body seemed to be full of strength. He turned his head to look at the remaining splitters. Without pausing, he put away the syringe and dragged another splitter over. He slaughtered it, collected the parasitic soul worm, and injected it into his magic mark. The luster of the splitter's magic mark seemed to have changed after absorbing the second parasitic soul worm of the same kind. There was a touch of dark silver at the edges of the rhombus. Dean rested for 10 minutes and continued to kill the third splitter. In the blink of an eye, Dean had absorbed 4 splitters' parasitic soul worms. He dragged one of the remaining 2 splitters. This splitter and the other one seemed to realize what would happen to them. When they were dragged by Dean, they violently struggled and screamed, seeming to be frightened and demonstrating. Dean dragged the splitter to a slightly open place and waved his dagger to kill it. He cut open the soft part of its body and saw a red spot sliding down along its internal organs that were exuding heat. He squatted down, picked it up with the arrow shaft, and put it into the jar. After washing it, he lured it to crawl out and threw it into the syringe. The 5th one. Dean looked at the struggling parasitic soul worm in the syringe. There was some nervousness and expectation in his heart. Although the success rate of devouring 5 of the same kind might not be 100%, he had prepared the 6th one. If the 6th one also failed, he still had the little splitter inside the giant wall. According to the dragon girl, the success rate of devouring 7 of the same kind was 70%. This was already a very high probability. Dean was ready to devour 7, but he still hoped that he would succeed when devouring 5. He hoped that his luck would not be so bad. He secretly prayed in his heart. Although the object of his prayer was aimless, this kind of prayer in the face of danger seemed to be a hidden instinct in his genes. He took a deep breath and pointed the needle at the previous magic mark. He rubbed the handle of the syringe and slowly pushed it. The vortex in the syringe quickly crushed and flattened the parasitic soul worm. Mucus and blood burst out. This liquid was mixed and injected along the needle into Dean's magic mark. Success! Success! Dean clenched his teeth and secretly shouted in his heart. The syringe was pushed to the end, but it was stuck in the body of the parasitic soul worm. He opened the air valve of the syringe, pulled back the handle, closed the air valve, and pushed it again. A little mucus remained in the needle, pushed by the air pressure and slowly injected into the magic mark. Dean repeatedly pushed it several times until the 5 parasitic soul worms were completely squeezed out. He pulled out the syringe and saw only a thin layer of skin at the bottom of the syringe. The bodies of the 5 parasitic soul worms only had a very thin layer of skin. Most of the body structure was the soft internal tissue. Dean was nervous and looked down at the magic mark on his chest. Time passed. After a few minutes, there was still no change in the magic mark. His face was ugly. He didn't expect his luck to be so bad. He gritted his teeth and came to the last remaining splitter. When the splitter saw Dean, it screamed in horror and moved back in fear. If other hunters saw this, they would be surprised. A dignified legendary monster was actually afraid of a human. Dean squatted down and was about to make a move. Suddenly, he felt an indescribable strange feeling from his chest to his whole body. Then, there seemed to be countless ants crawling on his back. It was very itchy. He was startled and took a few steps back. After he was far away from the splitter, he turned his head and suddenly saw a frightening scene. On both sides of his back, there were protruding blood vessels. These blood vessels were very thin and dense like a bright red silk net, forming a strange blood pattern. Moreover, the color of the blood was getting brighter and brighter. At the same time, he felt bursts of tearing pain, which was getting more and more intense. Very quickly, the blood vessels under the skin on his back became extremely clear, as if they were protruding out of his skin. The tearing pain also reached an extreme. He clenched his teeth and almost roared in pain, but very quickly, he saw a shocking scene. A large amount of dead skin appeared on the skin on his back, and at the same time, there was a blazing hot air coming out of his back. He had a terrifying feeling that his back was about to be separated from his body. This unknown change came from his body. Even with his temperament, he still felt a trace of fear, and it even made him forget about the pain. Soon, he saw the source of this terrifying change. He saw the dead skin on his back crack and fall off, and suddenly, a transparent light lit up on his back. A breeze blew. Time seemed to be frozen. The transparent thin wings unfurled from his back, stirring up a breeze that hit his face, causing him to be completely stunned. Wings? I actually have wings? He was stunned for a long time before he recovered. He suspected that he was a little dazzled. He blinked his eyes. The transparent thin wings were still swaying on his back. It was very real. His eyes widened and his heart was a little stunned. Is this the legendary magic mark deified? He suddenly remembered that the little splitter had stretched out its wings when it was chasing him. Yes, the splitter had wings like an insect. They were hidden under the sharp blade carapace on their back. However, the splitter's physique was too big. Their wings couldn't support them to fly at high altitude. They could only glide at low altitude, or use their wings to increase their speed when running up. Or they could rotate in the air to turn over in close combat. However, the magic mark of the splitter had made him grow wings after the deification, just like the splitter's wings. Dean couldn't help but touch the transparent wings on his back. He only felt that it was warm. It was different from the wings of an insect. The wings were extremely hard like a thin metal blade. He used his fingers to pinch it. However, it was only slightly deformed. When his fingers loosened, it returned to its original shape. The toughness was amazing. Dean tried to control the transparent wings. He found that there were 2 arms extending from his back. It was a wonderful feeling. He gently flapped the wings. It felt like the palm of his hand was brushing against the breeze. It was carefree and light. He gradually increased the frequency of flapping. Suddenly, a strong wind was generated. His body gently left the ground and floated up. Dean looked down and could see that his toes were dozens of centimeters off the ground. He was excited and excited. He could fly. He could fly by relying on his body. He landed and controlled the wings to move left and right. It was very obedient and natural. He played for a while before he recovered. there was a strange feeling in his heart. He didn't know whether he should be excited or depressed. There was no doubt that the wings were of great help to him. They could help him occupy the air advantage. Especially when he was hunting, he could enter an invincible state when he met some land monsters. He could only attack and not defend. However, as a human, he had a pair of insect-like wings. Was he still a human? He suddenly felt that while the parasitic soul worm provided him with power, it was also quietly changing his nature. At least, whether it was the definition of human in the old era or the post-disaster era, he did not belong to the category of human. Perhaps, as the nobles said, hunters were all monsters. Indeed, after absorbing the parasitic soul worm, the limbs changed. Some hunters' palms turned into claws, some pupils became red, and some teeth became sharp. These were all non-human characteristics. Moreover, long-term hunting, fighting on the edge of life and death, exposing the mood, and the violent tendency in human nature was greatly stimulated. Coupled with the changed appearance, it seemed that there was no difference from a monster. Thinking of this, he suddenly felt a faint sadness in his heart. Even the excitement he felt when he obtained the wings faded away. He sighed and controlled the wings to retract them. When he looked back at his appearance after the wings were retracted, he suddenly saw that there were still countless blood vessels on his back, like countless blood vessels. He was startled. He controlled the wings to lift up. Looking through the gap, he could still see the blood vessels. These blood vessels extended from his back to his waist and his nape. He lowered his head and raised his arm. He looked from his armpit to his waist. He found that his armpit and waist were also covered with blood vessels. Moreover, he saw these blood vessels on his arms, chest, and legs. He was like a person who was entangled by countless blood vessels. His pupils shrank and his heart was aghast. Although there was no mirror in the darkness, but he could imagine his appearance after being entangled by the blood vessels. He could also imagine how ugly his face would be at the moment. If he went back with this appearance, it was estimated that it would be extremely difficult to step into the Temple of Elements. Chapter 352. Dean cleaned up the things on the ground and put on his hunter armor. Now that he didn't have the extraordinary resistance of the magic mark, the radiation and the rain outside the giant wall, as well as the germs contained in the rotten corpses of the monsters, would cause damage to his body. As for whether the magic mark of the splitter could improve his resistance or not, he would have to go back to the giant wall to test it out. Squeak! The splitter, who was lying in the corner of the cave, saw Dean's movement. It screamed in horror and shrank its body. Dean looked at it and whispered, "Don't be afraid. You survived." Now that the magic mark of the splitter had been deified, there was no need to kill the splitter for the time being. He would either sell the parasitic soul worm in its body or leave it to someone he could absolutely trust. At present, he didn't have any plans for either of these things, so he could only put it aside for the time being. Dean moved away the boulder at the exit of the cave and went out. He felt a breath of fresh air blowing on his face. He turned back to block the cave. The corpses of the monsters in the cave would be enough for the splitter to eat for a month. It was estimated that some monsters would migrate here since there was no activity of the splitter in the vicinity. But it would be difficult for these monsters to attack the splitter in the cave. The first reason was that they wouldn't dare to attack the splitter. The second reason was that the splitter had reached the growth stage. It was a level 40 hunter. Although he had cut off its limbs and it had no claws, but its body was still strong. Coupled with its sharp teeth, it could easily tear most of the monsters. Dean glanced around the cave and saw some small red heat emitting from the grass hundreds of meters away. From the shape, it should be a common low-end monster in the wilderness. It should be a level 1 and 2 earthworm and jungle monster frog. Dean took back his eyes and turned away. Whoosh! Dean was a little surprised. His speed was faster than his imagination. The wind whistled in his ears, as if he was flying. His footsteps came to a halt, but his body steadily stopped, not swaying in the slightest. Dean couldn't help but look at his hands and feet. Did it mean that his physique was improved when the magic mark was deified? Had he evolved into a senior hunter? However, he remembered that the Dragon Clan girl had said that the divine magic mark would not improve his physique. Such speed is clearly possessed by a senior hunter. Moreover, only a top senior hunter can achieve this. Dean tried to run again. His steps were very easy, but his body was running forward at a very fast speed. With each step, he could jump 4 or 5 meters high. He could not help but jump with the help of a run-up. Suddenly, he felt like he was flying. He jumped 7 or 8 meters high. This was a leap of 2 floors. Dudien's knees were slightly bent as he landed on the ground. He didn't dare to feel any pain in his feet. He was surprised as he hadn't seen such jumping power and speed from Sergei and Gwyneth. Although their physical activities were greatly affected by the steel nails, but at the moment of crisis both of them were close to their peak speed. But it was still far from his current speed. Dean was surprised and happy. Although he wasn't clear about the situation, but the sudden increase in strength was an unexpected happy event. It was not in vain that the Splitter was called a legendary monster. If the Dragon Clan girl didn't deceive me, then I'm still an intermediate hunter. At least at the magic mark and cellular level. The reason why I have such strength is probably because of some changes in some tissues in my body. The muscle groups on my legs and arms, and even all over my body seem to have increased. Moreover, it's not a simple increase in muscle group. The muscle tissue should have mutated and produced power that is several times more than the original muscle group. Dean secretly speculated in his heart. If he wanted to confirm this speculation, then he only needed to go back to the giant wall and absorb new parasitic soul worms to become a senior hunter. If he could succeed, then it would mean that he was still an intermediate hunter. If he failed, then it would mean that the Dragon Clan girl had deceived him. Dean continued to run after sorting out his thoughts. Whoosh! The scenery in front of him was quickly pulled closer and then easily crossed over. The whistling wind hit his chest. Carefree and free, he smiled. After running for thousands of meters, Dean saw a dark red heat hidden in the ruins of a building overgrown with weeds. From the shape of the heat, it seemed to be a crocodile-like crawling creature. In such a humid environment, Dean suddenly thought of a monster, the jungle monitor lizard. He did not slow down. He ran straight ahead and stopped dozens of meters in front of the building. He saw the giant lizard inside slowly swing its tail, as if it was disturbed by his arrival. Then, it slowly crawled to the gate of the ruined building. The gate was covered with moss and vines, as well as weeds that were more than 10 feet long standing on the ground. It was completely covered. If there was no thermal vision, it would be hard to imagine that there was a giant lizard monster lurking in the grass, waiting for an opportunity to attack. I'll use you to practice my skills. Dean didn't mean to shake it off directly, nor did he want to pull out the arrow. After all, it was just a level 14 monster. If he was proficient in close combat, he could kill it alone with his previous speed and strength, not to mention his current keen speed. Even if his close combat ability was weak, he was still very confident. He bent down to pick up a stone and threw it. Whoosh! The stone shot into the vines and hit the face of the hidden lizard. But there was still no movement inside. Dean was surprised. He didn't expect this thing to be so tolerant. He bent down to pick up a boulder of 200 or 300 pounds, walked more than 10 meters, and threw it. Bang! As the boulder fell, the giant lizard inside immediately retreated to avoid it. At the same time, it rushed out like a tiger out of its cage, breaking through the weeds and vines, and rushed toward Dean. When it rushed out, Dean was surprised. This was not a jungle monitor, but a swordtail rock crocodile with a similar figure. It was a level 26 hunter. Run! Dean's first thought was to retreat. It must be known that when Glenn hunted the level 26 Black Weaver, she was in danger, not to mention he was only an intermediate hunter, and a melee rookie. Whoosh! He turned and ran, his figure like the wind. Bang! Bang! The sword-tail rock crocodile chased after him. The ground shook as it ran, but the sound of the vibration was getting farther and farther away. Dean looked back. He didn't expect that in the blink of an eye, he had thrown it hundreds of meters away. He was shocked and stopped. Seeing the sword-tail rock crocodile chasing him again, he slowed down and trotted. Although it was a trot, he still ran steadily in front of the latter, easily controlling the distance between them. After running for thousands of meters, Dean gradually had a feeling of eagerness in his heart. It seemed that this level 26 monster was not as terrible as he had imagined. In other words, with his current physique, fighting it was not impossible. Thinking of this, he immediately slowed down, holding the dagger, turned around and rushed up. Roar! When the sword-tail rock crocodile saw the prey it was chasing, it angrily opened its mouth to bite. Dean was already prepared. His body suddenly turned, and he slid to avoid it. In the blink of an eye, the dagger fiercely stabbed at the side of the crocodile's jaw where the blood vessels were densely packed. With a puff, the dagger pierced through the scales of the side of the crocodile's jaw. The blood vessels that were densely packed together were suddenly cut by the dagger. Dean pulled back and pulled out the dagger at the same time, only to find that the tip of the dagger was bent. Dean was secretly shocked. He hurriedly dodged the sword-tail rock crocodile's tail sweep. He didn't know where the courage came from, but he grabbed the scales on its back and turned over to mount it. Roar! The sword-tail rock crocodile roared angrily. It twisted its head, wanting to bite back, but it could only twist its head to about 90 degrees, unable to bite Dean. On the other hand, Dean's fingernails were tightly gripping the crocodile's back. Like steel nails, they were nailed into its hard gray carapace. The hardness of this carapace was comparable to rock, which was one of the reasons why it was called a rock crocodile. But at this moment, it was nailed inside by Dean's clasped scales. Dean was violently jolted on the crocodile's body. He raised his fist in anger and fiercely smashed it on the crocodile's head. Bang! With a punch, the violently shaking body of the sword-tail rock crocodile knocked its head on the ground. Dean seized the opportunity and quickly punched again. Bang! With another punch, the sword-tail rock crocodile's jaw hit the ground again. Seeing this, Dean swung his fist repeatedly. The sword-tail rock crocodile was hit by Dean's fist. It twisted its body in pain and finally threw Dean away. After Dean landed on the ground, he pounced again, still full of vigor. At this time, the sword-tail rock crocodile seemed to be exhausted and moved a lot slower. Dean waved the blunt tip of the dagger and stabbed it in its eye socket, cutting a big hole. He jumped on its head and stepped on its upper jaw. At the same time, he pulled out the dagger and stretched out 2 fingers to dig into its eye socket, ruthlessly tearing its eye bone. A few minutes later, the sword-tail rock crocodile fell into a pool of blood, no longer breathing. Dean sat on it, panting lightly. His heart was somewhat palpitating, but he was more excited. He had actually killed a level 26 monster with his bare hands. This was a task that even some experienced senior hunters would find difficult to accomplish alone. They could only kill it by relying on an ambush trap or a geographical advantage that was favorable to them. But at this moment, he was completely relying on the difference in speed and strength between the two of them, without any external factors. In terms of speed, strength, and reaction speed, my body should be comparable to a top senior hunter. If I had used a bow and arrow before, I could have easily kited it to death. Dean was excited. He thought that after getting the magic mark of the splitter, he could go back to the wall and buy other magic marks as nourishment to break through to a senior hunter. In his next plan, his strength was an important part. He didn't expect that after the deification of the magic mark of the splitter, he would have such strength, and there was hope for it to go further. Perhaps, even without the deification of the magic mark of the splitter alone would have such an impact. After all, He hadn't tested these aspects of his body before deification. Looking at the sword-tail rock crocodile, Dean stood up and collected the two relatively long and protruding molars from its mouth. Compared with the fat in its body and the leather armor on its body, the value of these two molars was much smaller. But for hunters like them, the value of these two molars was higher than gold. They could be forged into extremely sharp daggers or daggers. Dean washed the molars with the remaining filtered water and put them into his pocket. He turned around and left. As for the remaining leather armor and claws, he was too lazy to collect them. He made a running posture. Get ready to kill. Front? I like it. Sergei licked his lips. There was a bit of excitement in his eyes as he clenched the spear. Gwyneth was silent. She slowly wrapped the bandages around her arms. Whoosh! Dean exerted force on the soles of his feet and rushed out. Sergei and Gwyneth followed behind him. The three of them rapidly approached the stronghold and soon appeared in the line of sight of the patrolling sentries on top of the stronghold. When the sentinel saw the three figures galloping towards them through his binoculars, he thought he was seeing things. He removed his binoculars and blinked. From the plains, he could faintly see three black dots rushing towards them. When he looked through his binoculars again, he realized he was not seeing things. There were three people rushing towards the stronghold, and they were all armed. Enemy attack? The sentinel was startled. He quickly turned around and ran to sound the alarm. Dong! The alarm rang over the barrier. The patrols and spies lurking in the vicinity of the stronghold were all alerted by the alarm. They looked at the stronghold in shock and quickly gathered towards it. Whoosh! Hundreds of meters away, a black arrow pierced through the neck of the sentinel who was constantly pulling the alarm. The strong force of the arrow lifted the sentinel's body off the ground and nailed him on the wooden pillar next to the alarm booth. Dean was already hundreds of meters away from the stronghold. A few seconds after he shot the sentinel, he had already crossed the countless arrows and rushed straight to the bottom of the stronghold. He didn't stop. It seemed that there was still a way in front of him. He raised his feet and fiercely stepped on the wall as he was about to hit the wall. He borrowed the force to run up the wall. The Knights of Light were shocked by this scene. Dean was already 13 or 14 meters away from the wall by the time they reacted. Shoot the arrows! The captain of the knights on the barrier shouted in haste. Dean felt that his strength was not enough. His toes slammed into the ground, and his fingers quickly grabbed the high wall. A few shallow marks were left on the rock wall-like wall under his nails. He used the strength of his nails to grab the wall and jumped up. He rose like a phoenix under the high wall. The Knights of Light on the barrier were stunned, but they quickly reacted and hurriedly shot arrows. Dean waved the bow in his hand to block the arrows. He fell on the edge of the barrier and quickly rushed into the crowd. He put on the bow and grabbed a knight's spear. His arm shook and he threw the knight who was holding the spear to the back of the barrier. The knight didn't catch the spear and screamed as he fell down. Dean grabbed the spear and waved it. The tip of the spear swept across and cut the throats of several Knights of Light that were surrounding him. Go! Go! Stop him! This person is… Some of the Knights of Light seemed to recognize the amazing enemy. However, they didn't have time to say Dean's name. Dean's spear pierced through their chests and sent them flying into the crowd. Nevertheless, some of the knights who were standing on the outer edge recognized Dean's identity and exclaimed in shock. Dudian was like a wolf in a flock of sheep. He quickly harvested the lives around him. Occasionally warm blood splashed on his face, but he didn't feel it. From time to time he recalled the scene of Splitter rushing into the stronghold. He also recalled the scene of him killing the evil alchemist in the dark. In the blink of an eye, the passage of the barrier was full of corpses. Sergei and Gwyneth used their weapons to climb down from the high wall under the cover of Dean's absorption of firepower. You are Dean. There was a middle-aged knight who was guarding the barrier. He was in a hurry as he saw Dean's body bathed in blood. He wasn't able to finish his words as he was interrupted by Dean's spear. The knight's face turned cold as he waved his sword to fight with Dean. His face changed as soon as the fight started. The strength of Dean's spear shook the knight so much that he almost couldn't hold his weapon. Dean kept attacking the middle-aged knight's chest with his spear, forcing him to retreat step by step. His close combat ability was naturally inferior to other hunters, but compared to the knight inside the giant wall, the gap was narrowed a lot. At this moment, relying on speed and strength to crush the Knight of Light who had a physique comparable to a senior hunter, he couldn't fight back. After a few minutes of fighting, both of them had exchanged hundreds of moves. The middle-aged knight's physical strength was gradually exhausted. Dudien's spear pierced through his chest but didn't directly pierce through his heart. Dudien threw him to the bottom of the barrier. Dean jumped down from the high wall. The height of the wall was only about 20 meters. With his physique, he wouldn't suffer any injuries. The moment he landed, Dean used his spear to stab the middle-aged knight's neck. Architect, no. The middle-aged knight looked at Dean in horror. He waved his hand to resist but couldn't stop the spear. His neck was pierced. His eyes were wide open as he looked at the direction of the barrier where Dean was. Dean pulled out the spear and waved it again. He stabbed the chest, heart, hands and feet a few times. He poked 7 or 8 holes in the body. Then he turned around and left. He relied on his thermal vision to quickly find the fish that had escaped the net and killed them. Sergei and Gwyneth were also covered in blood. They gathered around Dean. Both of them were out of breath. "Young master, are you done?" Sergei looked at the corpses. His face was tired but excited at the same time. Dean nodded. "Make some wounds on all the corpses. It is best to destroy the original wounds." Sergei immediately picked up the weapons on the ground and made up the wounds on the corpses. Gwyneth glanced at Dudien and followed Sergei to finish him off. Dean came to the side of the middle-aged knight. He took out an arrow from the quiver and nailed it into the knight's mouth. He held the knight's finger and slowly wrote 6 words on the sand. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.